Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was a quiet countryside road, the kind that winds its way through rolling hills and old woods. My friends and I were on a spontaneous road trip, seeking out places off the beaten path. We had no real destination in mind, only the thrill of discovery. Our GPS showed nothing but empty fields and dense forest for miles. And that's when we saw it, a gate. It was an ornate iron gate, its curves and spirals rusted with age, standing at the edge of an overgrown path. Ivy had crept over the gate like a living blanket, weaving its way through the metal. A sign hung crookedly on one side, but the words were faded beyond recognition. We hesitated for only a moment, then agreed to explore. The garden beyond the gate was something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Wildflowers covered the ground, their colors vivid despite the neglected state of the garden. Broken statues loomed in the distance, their features worn away by time and weather. Crumbling stone walls still stood at intervals, barely holding, together beneath the weight of ivy and moss. There was no sign of life, but a weight pressed down on us, something ancient and unwelcome. As we walked further in, the air grew colder and the sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by an unnatural stillness. My breath puffed out in cold, white clouds, even though the sun was still high in the sky. "This place is creepy," Jessie whispered, her voice trembling. She clutched her jacket tightly around her. "Yeah, something's not right," James agreed, his gaze flicking around nervously. We continued deeper into the garden, stepping carefully around the uneven ground. It felt like we were being watched, though there was no one to see. The shadows twisted unnaturally around the statues and broken fountains, flickering in ways that weren't natural. As we rounded a corner, we stumbled upon a small pavilion in the center of the garden, a circular open-air structure with a collapsed roof and rotting wooden benches. At its heart was an old, moss-covered fountain, its water long gone. I peered inside the basin, and for a brief second, I thought I saw movement, a reflection of something otherworldly beneath the surface. "Hey, check this out," I said, but my voice sounded distant, almost disembodied. "Don't," Jess said quickly, pulling me away from the fountain. "Let's get out of here, now." But before we could move, the silence broke. A low, rasping whisper drifted from the shadows. "Welcome. Welcome." My breath caught. We all froze in place, looking around wildly, but there was nothing there. "Who's there?" James shouted, his voice a shaky echo in the stillness. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. "Welcome. Home." The wind picked up suddenly, whipping through the garden. The flowers rustled violently, petals scattering into the air. Shadows swirled around us, dark tendrils moving through the sunlight. They were no longer confined to the edges. They were alive, shifting, closing in. "I'm done," Jess said, her voice panicked as she backed away. "We need to leave. Now." We ran, our steps pounding against the cobblestones, lungs burning as we pushed forward. The whispers echoed louder behind us, filling the garden with a haunting chorus. We reached the gate, hands fumbling to unlock it, but the iron refused to move. It was as if the garden itself had taken control. A hand brushed against my arm. A cold, bony touch, dry as dust. I screamed, struggling to break free as the others screamed too. The shadows were upon us, wrapping around our limbs, dragging us into darkness. In that final moment, the whispers came once more, eerily calm. "You will never leave." It was a small, forgotten chapel nestled deep within a forest. We had heard whispers of its existence through word of mouth, but no maps, no signs pointed to its location. After hiking for hours, lost in the dense woods, we finally found it, a koyaji-hui, weathered stone structure draped with ivy, its wooden doors slightly ajar. We entered cautiously. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and forgotten candles. The windows were shattered, allowing beams of filtered light to sneak through the cracks, casting long, shifting shadows across the pews. "There's no one here," Olivia whispered, her voice uneasy. "No one's been here for years," I replied, running a hand over the ancient stone altar at the front. The carvings were faded, and time had worn away the once intricate patterns. As we explored, the chapel seemed almost alive. Whispers echoed from unseen corners, soft and distant. At first, we dismissed them as the wind, but the air inside remained still. The longer we stayed, the more the voices became distinct, faint, haunting melodies, as though someone was singing a hymn long forgotten. "What's that?" Max said, stopping abruptly. His flashlight flickered, then died completely. The others reached for their devices, but all electronics refused to function properly. Screens flickering, signal lost. The chapel's only light was the dim glow from the cracks in the walls. The whispers grew louder, rising into indistinct murmurs. We huddled close, trying to ignore the cold drafts brushing against our skin. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the silence pressed heavier, suffocating us. Suddenly, we heard the faint shuffle of footsteps, a slow, deliberate pacing, circling us. Each step echoed in the vast emptiness of the chapel, yet there was no one there. "Stay together," I whispered, pulling the group closer. The footsteps stopped. Silence engulfed us once again. And then, just as we began to relax, a voice, deep, guttural, whispered directly into our ears. "Leave." We screamed, each voice shattering the tension. But the chapel didn't answer, only the dissonant echoes of our fear. Max pushed toward the entrance, but the doors had shut themselves, sealed by an invisible force. The chanting started again. Low, mournful hymns that filled the space with dread. The ground beneath us trembled slightly, the walls shifting ever so slightly. Shadows danced wildly, twisting around us like angry spirits. "Help us," came another voice, this one clearer, more desperate. It wasn't human. It was old, corrupted by centuries of sorrow. "Run!" Olivia screamed. We bolted toward the door, pushing against the resistance that pulled us back. The whispers followed, louder now, an unbearable cacophony of anguish. It felt like the chapel itself was devouring us, its ancient walls clawing into our very sanity. As we forced through the exit, the voices faded. The chapel, once again, still and empty. But the memory of that haunting night lingered, its whispers trailing behind us long after we left. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I stumbled upon the old observatory. Hidden deep in the woods, it was a place none of us had ever heard of. Just a crumbling, ivy-covered building with a faded sign that read, "Observatory of the Stars." The roof had collapsed, leaving the towering telescope exposed to the sky, while the windows were long shattered, their jagged edges resembling teeth in a broken jaw. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, but curiosity pushed us forward. We explored the surrounding grounds, rotted benches, twisted vines strangling stone statues, and empty paths that led nowhere in particular. Despite the unsettling silence, the place felt oddly peaceful at first. "It looks like something out of a horror movie," Emma whispered, her voice carrying through the emptiness. We wandered inside, stepping cautiously over debris and piles of broken glass. The main room was vast, with the remains of a grand telescope pointed at the sky. The floor creaked underfoot, and shadows twisted unnaturally in the dim light. This must have been used for something astronomical. Jack said, running a hand over the dusty console that once controlled the telescope's movements. His voice wavered. Suddenly, there was a soft sound, like a whisper, too faint to understand. It seemed to come from deep within the observatory, a rustling of paper or a distant sigh. We froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, though even I wasn't convinced. We continued exploring, but the whispers followed us, whispers that grew clearer with each step. They weren't in a language we knew. They weren't human voices at all. Instead, they spoke in haunting echoes, as if the very walls were alive and breathing with the sound of forgotten knowledge. We climbed to the observatory's top level, where the massive telescope once dominated the sky. The view was stunning, an endless stretch of forest and distant mountains. But something about it felt wrong. The stars didn't twinkle as they should. They seemed too close, almost as if we could reach out and touch them. The whispers grew, louder, filling the air with unintelligible verses that spoke of cosmic horrors and ancient sacrifices. Jack began pacing, his hands over his ears, trying to drown out the voices. "We have to get out of here," he yelled, his voice cracking. "This place is messing with us." "Wait," Sarah said suddenly, pointing toward the telescope's control panel. "Look at this." The buttons and dials flickered faintly, as though they were moving on their own. The telescope trembled slightly, then stopped, directing its lens downward toward the ground. Beneath us, the earth seemed to shift, as though it wasn't solid. A circular, endless pit formed, spiraling down into darkness. "We need to leave," I said again, my voice more urgent this time. Emma had backed into a corner, tears streaming down her face. I can't," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Run!" Jack screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the staircase. The whispers turned into screams now, a cacophony of torment and madness. The shadows leapt from the walls, grasping at us with clawed hands. The telescope moved on its own, slowly but steadily, aimed at the pit that seemed to swallow the sky. With one final burst of adrenaline, we rushed toward the staircase and leapt down it in a panic. The screams didn't follow us outside, not directly. But as we stumbled away from the observatory, we glanced back and saw that the stars in the sky were gone, replaced by a void so deep, so terrifying, that we could feel its pull even from afar. The observatory stood in silence once more. No whispers, no screams, only the shadows of a forgotten reality. It was a quiet road trip through the countryside, just me and a few friends. The sun was beginning to set as we drove down a narrow, winding road, thick with trees. We were searching for a place to camp, away from the usual crowded campgrounds. That's when we spotted the old garden house. It stood at the end of a broken, gravel path, a dilapidated structure with ivy creeping up its weathered brick walls. Windows were boarded up, and the once beautiful garden surrounding it had long been overtaken by weeds and wild growth. My friends hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. "This looks perfect," Sarah said, her voice a little shaky as we approached the house. The air felt different here, cooler, somehow oppressive. The stillness was unsettling, punctuated only by the occasional creak of old wood beneath our steps. Inside, the house was dark and musty, with cobwebs stretched across every surface. Faint whispers could be heard from the corners, brushing against our ears like restless murmurs. "This place is empty, right?" James asked, his voice uneasy. He ran a hand along the dusty mantelpiece, his fingers leaving streaks behind. "We've been here too long," I warned, but no one listened. They were drawn to the faded photographs on the walls, the worn furniture covered in moth-eaten fabric. As we explored deeper into the house, the temperature dropped, sending shivers down our spines. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, thin, reedy voices speaking in languages we couldn't understand. We couldn't make out their words, but the tone was clear. They weren't welcoming. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut behind us, shaking the entire house with a low, echoing thud. We spun around, panic setting in. "Who did that?" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. "I didn't touch it," James shouted, his eyes wide with fear. "It was open a second ago." The room darkened. The flickering candlelight cast, twisted, shadows along the walls. A chill swept through the house, colder than any breeze from a window could explain. The whispers became deafening, a chorus of voices surrounding us, pressing in from every direction. I could feel them. Their presence was more than sound. It was a malevolent force, pushing down on our minds like a heavy weight. Panic surged, but no one dared move. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, cloaked in black, with a face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Its form was twisted, unnatural, its movements slow and deliberate. Behind it, more shapes began to appear. Ghastly figures, hunched and twisted, their eyes glinting in the dim light. "Run!" Sarah shrieked, and we bolted toward the back door. But as we neared it, the door vanished, replaced by more darkness. The hallway twisted, impossibly long, as if we were trapped in a nightmarish maze. I could hear them now, soft, guttural laughter echoing around us. They surrounded us, closing in, their whispers filling our heads with torment. I felt my breath hitch in my throat as I stumbled, falling to my knees. "Wake up," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, wake up." The house was still. The figures, the whispers, they were gone. The light returned and the front door stood wide open, welcoming us into the calm night once more. But the house, that house, was never truly empty. It had claimed us, even if only for a moment. It was a quiet town on the edge of a forested hillside where nothing much happened. My friends and I decided to hike up the hill, convinced by the stories of an old abandoned house said to be at the summit. We were told it had stood empty for decades, yet some claimed they'd seen strange lights flicker through the windows, heard whispers carried by the wind. Curiosity pushed us forward. The climb was steep, and the sun was already dipping behind the trees by the time we reached the top. The view was breathtaking. A wide stretch of forest laid out below us, while behind us was nothing but the hill, untouched and forgotten. Only the house remained, a dark silhouette against the fading light. As we approached, the air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled in the air. The front door creaked on its hinges, revealing a foyer shrouded in shadows. Dust covered everything, and the scent of decay was overpowering. This house had been abandoned for far too long. Inside, we split up to explore. Each room was more haunting than the last. Faded wallpaper peeling away, furniture rotting, cobwebs draping over every corner. Books were scattered across the floor, the pages curling with age. Strange symbols were etched into the wooden beams, their meaning long lost to time. I wandered into what must have been the main living room, where an old grandfather clock stood silent in the corner. The hands had stopped at midnight, decades ago. I shivered, uneasy at the oppressive silence. It felt as though the house had been waiting for us, trapped in its own nightmare for years. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the stillness. A whisper, distant and eerie. My breath hitched. I glanced toward the other rooms, but everyone was still upstairs out of sight. It came again, closer this time. A voice, hissing words that sent a chill down my spine. "Leave. Now." I froze in place. A cold breeze swept through the room, despite every window being shut. Shadows flickered across the walls, shifting unnaturally. My heartbeat quickened, a primal fear taking over. "Guys," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you hearing this?" There was no response. I hurried toward the entrance, but the door wouldn't budge. The handle refused to turn, no matter how hard I pulled. I yanked again, panic bubbling in my chest. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me in a cacophony of tormenting voices. "You shouldn't be here," they hissed over and over. You shouldn't have come. The temperature dropped to unbearable levels. My breath fogged in front of me, but the cold wasn't natural. It felt alive, watching, pressing in from every direction. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision, closer, closer. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, light, uneven, almost as if they were circling me. I turned frantically, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing there. Only darkness. Suddenly, the whisper changed. Clearer now, filled with malice. "You can't leave!" My scream pierced the house. I bolted toward the back, ignoring the creeping fear that clawed at my mind. Somehow, I forced the door open, a heavy wooden panel covered in vines, and stumbled into the night. Outside, the cold air was sharp against my skin. I fell onto the ground, gasping for breath as the whispers faded away, swallowed by the night. My friends came rushing down the hill, their faces pale. "What happened? Where's everyone else?" Sam cried out. "I don't know," I whispered, staring back at the house. It stood there, silent once again, like a mausoleum that had never really let us go. It was late summer when we stumbled upon the field. Miles from any town, deep within the countryside, it stretched endlessly. A vast expanse of tall, waving grass, dotted with wildflowers. The sky above was an ominous shade of gray, the kind that seems to press down on you, suffocating with every breath. We couldn't resist exploring. The air was eerily still. The moment we stepped inside, a strange weight settled around us. The grass was thick, the stalks brushing against our legs, whispering faintly as we walked. The whispers sounded distant at first, almost natural, like the rustling of the wind through tall grass. But as we moved further in, they grew louder, more like soft murmurs, as though hundreds of voices were speaking at once. "We should turn back," Emily said, her voice quivering. "This isn't right." "It's just a field," Mark reassured her, though his confidence was hollow. "Nothing more." The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the landscape. The field seemed to stretch forever, its borders blending into the horizon. There were no roads, no other people for miles, just us and the endless grass. Setting. Up camp felt off. The tent wouldn't stay pegged to the ground, the earth shifting unnaturally beneath it. No matter how hard we pushed the stakes into the soil, they simply refused to hold. A strange unease settled in as we struggled to assemble. The campsite, the whispers growing louder all the while. "We need a fire," Mark suggested, though his voice was hesitant. "It might help keep whatever's out there away." We managed to start a fire, but it did little to ease the oppressive atmosphere. The flames flickered wildly, casting warped shadows that danced around the edges of our vision. Every movement in the grass seemed more pronounced now, silent shapes shifting just out of sight. Suddenly, the breeze picked up, though there was no wind. The whispers morphed into something more distinct, a chorus of faint, unintelligible words. They surged through the air, becoming louder and more intrusive with each passing moment. "Stop it," Emily yelled, covering her ears. "It's not real." But the voices weren't inside our heads. They were in the field, a living presence, a presence that followed us, stalked us through the endless expanse of grass. We could feel it circling us now, growing bolder with every step we took. "Run!" Mark shouted, breaking into a sprint. We bolted, pushing through the tangled, knee-high grass, desperate to escape. Each step felt heavier, harder to take, as if the earth itself was pulling us back. The whispers turned into screams, hundreds of voices rising in unison. Something brushed against my leg, a cold, skeletal hand. I screamed, falling to the ground. I could hear them now, the whispers shifting into guttural laughter. They circled, us, moving faster than we could see, moving as though they weren't bound by the laws of reality. Emily stumbled and cried out as another unseen force grabbed her shoulder. Her screams were drowned by the laughter, the voices growing deafening. I could hear them calling my name now, softly at first, then louder, until it felt like the field itself was alive with their cries. Mark reached back and pulled me to my feet. "We have to get to the edge," he yelled, his voice hoarse. We pushed forward, struggling against the suffocating weight of the field. The darkness deepened and the screams intensified, filling the air with a cacophony that felt like it would tear us apart. When we finally reached the edge, the distant boundary where the grass met the sky, the whispers abruptly stopped. The voices faded into silence, leaving only the sound of our heavy breathing. We collapsed at the edge, trembling, the oppressive presence of the field still lingering around us. Looking back, the field was empty, silent, still. But we knew better. Whatever was in that field hadn't gone away. It was watching. It was an old house tucked away in the middle of the woods, surrounded by tall, shadowy trees. We had heard the stories. The house had been abandoned for decades, left to decay. But curiosity had driven us there, a group of friends looking for something different, something thrilling. We weren't expecting to find much beyond dust and silence. The house itself was massive, with a grand porch and broken windows that seemed to peer into the dark forest. We pushed open the heavy front door, the creak loud in the still air. Inside, the air was thick with mildew, and the floorboards groaned under our every step. The place was a museum of decay. Antique furniture draped with cobwebs, faded wallpaper, peeling from the walls, and rooms filled with the forgotten relics of the past. We explored for hours, laughing, joking, and teasing each other about ghosts and shadows. It felt like a harmless adventure, even when we ventured into the basement. The cellar door was hidden beneath a heavy rug in what used to be the dining room. Dust flew up in clouds as we moved it away, revealing the old, warped steps descending into darkness. "Come on," Sam urged, flashlight already in hand. Reluctantly, we followed him down. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of damp earth growing more intense. The stone walls felt ancient, alive in a way that made my skin crawl. At the bottom, we found a single room, a wide, dirt-floored space with shelves of rotting books and broken furniture stacked in the corners. A single dim bulb flickered from the ceiling, casting unsettling shadows. "This place gives me the creeps," Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "Nothing's going to happen," I said, trying to sound confident, but even I felt uneasy. We moved through the room, searching for anything of interest. That's when Sam found the door, small, almost hidden beneath piles of debris. It wasn't locked, and with some effort, we pushed it open. Beyond was a narrow, cold hallway leading deeper, into the earth. "Who wants to bet what's down here?" Mark said with a nervous laugh. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. The air grew heavier the further we went, pressing against our chests with an unnatural weight. Each step echoed, blending with the unsettling silence. And then, voices. At first, it was soft whispers, too quiet to understand. They began to form words, unintelligible at first, but growing clearer as we moved deeper. "Get out. Leave. Don't look back." Lily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Stop," she whispered. "I don't like this." "Almost there," Sam insisted. His voice was steady, but his flashlight flickered. The others paused to check their equipment, their faces pale in the dim light. Suddenly, the whispers became screams, angry, desperate, echoing through the tunnel. The flickering light went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. Panic set in. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, but its weak beam only illuminated a few feet ahead. The screams grew louder, closer now, until we could feel their presence. The air was cold enough to see our breath, and every breath seemed heavier, harder to take. "Run!" Mark yelled, breaking the silence. We turned and sprinted back toward the cellar entrance, but it was no use. The shadows seemed to stretch toward us, elongating in the flickering darkness. I tripped over something, an old, rusted tool buried beneath the debris. As I fell, the whispers grew into a deafening chorus, filling the air with maddening noise. I clawed at the ground, struggling to get up, but the shadows surged forward, pulling me into the abyss. The last thing I saw was Sam's flashlight disappearing into the darkness, the screams fading into silence. When I woke, the cellar was empty. The house stood silent once again, as though nothing had ever happened. But the whispers, those never stopped. It was just after sunset when we found it, an old, forgotten toll road hidden deep in the woods. We were on a late-night drive, trying to take a shortcut back to the main highway, when the GPS directed us off the main road and onto a winding, overgrown path. The air grew cooler the farther we went, and soon the pavement beneath the tires was cracked and littered with leaves. "There's no way this road is still in use," Jake said from the passenger seat, looking out at the dense trees closing in around us. "Are you sure this is the right way?" "I guess we'll find out," I replied, uneasy but curious. There was something eerily quiet about the area. No sound of animals, no rustling leaves, only the occasional crunch of tires on gravel. The road stretched ahead, disappearing into the blackness of the forest. Old streetlights, long broken or stolen, stood motionless along the way, casting jagged shadows that danced in the darkness. We hadn't seen another vehicle in miles. Eventually, we came across a small toll booth, rotting, the wood splintered and crumbling away. A thick layer of vines and moss clung to its roof, completely covering the windows and entrance. The toll booth was abandoned. No attendant, no barrier blocking the road. "Should we turn back?" Emma asked, gripping her phone tightly. "Let's keep going," I said, despite the heavy unease settling in my chest. We drove past the toll booth, the silence pressing in harder now, as though the forest itself was watching. The road twisted ahead, curving sharply deeper into the woods. We lost our bearings, relying solely on the dim glow of the headlights to guide us. The GPS was spotty, constantly cutting out, leaving us guessing at our exact location. "Does anyone else feel like we're going in circles?" Jake asked after the third or fourth loop around the same bend. We had passed the same landmarks. Twice now. Cracked trees, dead branches piled along the edge of the road, yet we couldn't shake the feeling that something was leading us astray. The headlights flickered suddenly, then went out completely. I cursed under my breath, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. "Great," I muttered. "Now what?" We sat in complete darkness, the hum of the engine cutting off as the car sputtered to a stop. The only sounds now were our breathing, panicked and rapid, and the faint rustling of trees that seemed to encroach upon the car. "We need to get out," Emma said, her voice trembling. "See if there's anything wrong with the battery." "No way," Jake replied, his voice sharp. "We'll be walking straight into the woods if we do that." Before we could decide, a sound broke the stillness. A low, guttural hum, almost mechanical, coming from deeper in the forest. It wasn't human, it wasn't natural. The sound was almost mechanical, like a twisted version of a chainsaw or an old engine, grinding its way through the silence. "Turn on the flashlight," I whispered, fumbling for my phone. But as the light flickered, I saw them, the figures. At first, they were just shapes moving between the trees, dark silhouettes. Slowly, they formed into something more coherent, humanoid, yet not quite human. Their features were twisted, grotesque, with hollow eyes and mouths that moved in silent screams. The hum grew louder, impossibly loud, vibrating in my bones. They were getting closer. "Drive!" Emma screamed. "Drive!" I fumbled for the keys, but the car refused to start. The engine made a low, sputtering sound before dying completely. "Get out," Jake shouted, opening his door. I followed, but as we stepped into the woods, the figures were there. Dozens of them, silent, watching. Their twisted forms moved slowly, deliberately, their grotesque faces bearing expressions of agony and hunger. "Run!" I yelled, but there was nowhere to run. The forest seemed endless, an inescapable maze of trees and darkness. We ran until we couldn't breathe, until the sounds of their hum were drowned out by our own screams. But they never stopped following. It was late fall when we stumbled upon the old orchard. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The once lush fruit had long since rotted away, leaving nothing but skeletal remnants on the branches. We were driving through the countryside, searching for a quiet place to camp for the night. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the desolate orchard, and we couldn't resist the curiosity pulling us toward it. The air was colder than it should have been. As we walked through the uneven ground, the grass crunched beneath, our boots dry and brittle. The silence was unsettling. No chirping birds, no rustling of leaves, only the distant, oppressive stillness. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I mean, we're here now," Liam said with a nervous laugh. "Might as well explore a bit." The path we followed was barely discernible, marked only by patches of flattened grass where other visitors may have ventured years ago. Each step deeper into the orchard felt heavier, as if the weight of the place itself was pressing down on us. We came upon a grove of ancient apple trees with twisted roots creeping from the ground like veins. The fruit they bore had long since rotted away, leaving blackened husks hanging from the branches like decayed skulls. Even the slightest breeze seemed to hum through the trees, almost whispering unintelligible words. "Let's head back," I said. "This feels wrong." Before we could turn, the faintest of sounds reached our ears, a quiet, shuffling noise like dry leaves being dragged across the ground. We froze. The orchard seemed to hold its breath as we strained to listen. The sound grew louder, inching closer, yet we saw nothing. "Hello?" Liam called out, his voice quivering. The shuffling stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. The air grew colder, the oppressive stillness thickening until it became suffocating. A faint mist began to rise from the ground, swirling around our ankles, and an unnatural chill seeped into our bones. Suddenly, the trees creaked. A low, guttural groan echoed through the orchard, like the tortured wails of something long dead. The blackened apples rustled as if something unseen was moving among them. "What's happening?" Sarah whispered, panic evident in her voice. Figure emerged from the mist, a twisted, emaciated silhouette, its body contorted unnaturally. It had no face, only a dark void where its features should have been. Long, claw-like hands extended toward us, each finger twitching with jerky, unnatural movements. We turned to run, but the ground beneath our feet became slick with mud, dragging us down. The figure closed in, its breath a cold whisper against our skin, its claws swiping the air as if searching for a hold. "Wake up!" Liam shouted, breaking free from the mud with sheer determination. The mist lifted, and the figure vanished just as suddenly as it appeared. We gasped for breath, falling onto the hard ground. The orchard was still, silent once more. But even after we left, the feeling lingered, an unsettling presence in the back of our minds, as if the orchard would never truly let us go. It was a weekend trip meant for relaxation. My friends and I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, a cozy retreat far from the city's noise. The cabin was tucked away on a quiet, barely used trail, surrounded by towering pines and the distant sounds of nature. The first night passed peacefully with a warm fire crackling in the stone fireplace and laughter echoing softly through the wooden walls. But something wasn't quite right. As the days went by, a strange unease settled over the cabin. Every time we ventured outside, the woods seemed quieter, darker. The birds stopped singing, and the wind seemed to avoid our path altogether. We didn't realize how isolated we truly were until the third night. The cabin's only source of light was a single lantern hanging from the ceiling, and as night fell, shadows grew long and restless. The wooden beams creaked under the weight of silence. That night we went to bed early, each of us feeling the creeping weight of an invisible presence watching from the darkness. I awoke sometime after midnight, my body tense and my breath shallow. A soft, scraping sound came from outside the window, a sound too deliberate, too close. I listened carefully, heart thudding in my chest, but the noise stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I gently slid out of bed and moved to the window. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, its shadows swallowing the cabin in darkness. There was nothing unusual in sight, only trees, their gnarled branches swaying gently in the wind. Still, an oppressive weight pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I crawled back into bed, trying to dismiss the panic creeping through my veins. Just a sound, nothing more. But my friends weren't sleeping peacefully. I could hear soft whispers in the room, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to press against the walls. They weren't coming from any of us. "Stop," I whispered, shaking my friend's shoulder. "Wake up." She didn't move. The whispers grew louder, twisting into indistinct words I couldn't understand. I stumbled out of bed, rushing to wake the others, but they all appeared frozen in place, their faces pale, eyes wide open but unblinking, as though they were lost in something beyond consciousness. Panic surged through me as I bolted for the door. I had to get them out, away from whatever was happening. But when I twisted the knob, it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. I screamed, desperately pulling at it, my hands going numb with cold. Behind me, the whispers turned into screams, horrific, inhuman cries, spilling into the room like a tide of agony. I spun back around, only to see them. Faces pressed against the windows, noses flattened against the glass, dark, hollow eyes, staring in. They were pale figures, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins, teeth jagged and sharp. Shadows wove around them, twisting their forms in impossible ways. I stumbled backward into the corner of the room, breathing heavily. The figures seemed to breathe in sync with me, their whispers and screams feeding into the room's atmosphere. The air grew colder, heavier. Suddenly, the whispers ceased. The figures disappeared. Everything was still again, only my ragged breathing broke the silence. I turned slowly, expecting them to reappear at any moment, but the windows and walls were empty. I woke my friends one by one, each of them groggy, disoriented. None of them remembered the events, or the whispers, or the figures. We couldn't explain what had happened, only that the air felt lighter now, as if the terror had vanished with the dawn. That night we locked the door and huddled together on the floor, too afraid to sleep again. When morning came, we packed up and left the woods behind, never looking back. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, just a few friends wanting to escape the noise of the city for a few days. We found a secluded spot deep in the woods, a small clearing beside a quiet, shadowy lake. The sun was setting when we arrived, casting long, dark silhouettes across the forest. Everything seemed perfect at first. We set up our tents, built a fire, and sat around talking, laughing. The air was crisp and the sounds of the wilderness surrounded us. Leaves rustling, distant howls of animals, and the occasional splash from the lake. But as night fell, the atmosphere grew unsettling. I had always felt a strange unease when camping deep in forests like this. Something about being so far from civilization, surrounded by the unknown, made the world feel smaller, more vulnerable, and the feeling intensified as the hours went on. At first, it was little things. Shadows moving too quickly when I glanced around, rustling leaves that seemed louder than they should be. I told myself it was just paranoia, that the forest played tricks on the mind. But then, the sounds began, a soft whispering, faint and insistent. It wasn't quite in the wind, it was deeper, as if coming from the trees themselves. I shook it off until I heard my name being called. Low, breathy, almost musical in its insistence. It wasn't any of my friends. I knew it wasn't. "Guys?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. The others were too busy joking around to hear. They laughed and told stories about the area's legends, phantoms of lost campers, voices that spoke through the trees. I laughed with them, though the fear still clawed at my stomach. We went to sleep inside our tents, leaving the fire burning, low for warmth. The night was quiet, except for the occasional splash from the lake, but in the dead of night, the whispers returned, louder now, more distinct. I couldn't tell where they came from. They seemed to come from all around, weaving through the trees, circling our campsite like a twisted song. I pressed my hand against my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers spoke of things I couldn't comprehend. Nonsense phrases, fragments of words with a haunting cadence. Suddenly, the rustling outside my tent grew frantic. The fabric trembled as though something not human was circling it. I froze, too afraid to make a sound, breath caught in my throat. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of distorted voices now. It felt as though I were on the edge of something indescribable, something ancient and malevolent. Every moment passed in a terrifying rush, each second stretching impossibly longer. Without warning, the tent door was ripped open. Cold air rushed inside, along with the overwhelming scent of decay. My heart stopped. There, standing at the edge of the firelight, was a figure cloaked in darkness. A silhouette devoid of a face, just an empty void where its eyes should have been. It moved slowly toward me, its limbs unnatural, bent at impossible angles. I screamed. The next moment, the figure was gone. My friends were awake now, rushing toward me. The whispers had faded, but I couldn't shake the terror still clinging to my mind. We packed up immediately, leaving the campsite in the dead of night. The lake reflected the dim moonlight eerily as we hurried away from the woods, the sounds of the forest fading behind us. Whatever had been there was gone, but I knew it wasn't truly over. The whispers still echoed in my mind, a haunting refrain I couldn't forget. We never returned to that place. It was late afternoon when we stumbled upon the meadow. We were deep into the forest, following an old overgrown trail we had found by chance. The sun barely broke through the thick canopy above, casting long shifting shadows on the forest floor. Everything was peaceful. Too peaceful. The meadow appeared suddenly, almost as if it had been hidden by the trees themselves. A vast, open space filled with wildflowers and tall, swaying grass. The air was heavy, laced with the scent of damp earth and the faintest hint of something floral, but not quite natural. There was a stillness that was almost oppressive. "We should set up camp here," Jake said, breaking the silence. His voice felt too loud, echoing unnaturally in the vast space. "No," Emily said, her voice a whisper. "Something's wrong with this place." We didn't listen. The meadow was too beautiful to ignore. We spread out our gear, setting up, our tents near the edge of the trees. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Shadows lengthened, and the peace of the afternoon gave way to something colder, more unsettling. As night fell, the meadow transformed. The air grew colder, and the once peaceful hum of nature faded into a dead silence. We sat around the fire, but none of us spoke much. The quiet was too heavy, too dense. "I swear," Jake said, breaking the silence again, "I keep hearing whispers." "No," Emily said, shaking her head. "Not whispers. More like breathing. Like something is right behind me." I turned, scanning the meadow beyond the firelight. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving only silhouettes of tall grass and swaying wildflowers. Nothing moved, no wind, no rustling leaves. Yet the feeling of being watched pressed down on us like a vice. Suddenly, the campfire flickered, sending shadows dancing wildly across the tents and trees. The shadows moved unnaturally, no breeze to guide them. They twisted and stretched, taking forms that were impossible to explain. I could swear I saw faces in them. Cold, hollow faces that seemed to peer from the edges of the light. Emily screamed, "They're coming closer!" We leapt to our feet, hearts racing, but it was impossible to outrun the shadows. They slithered across the ground, creeping towards us from all directions. The whispers returned, louder now, accompanied by guttural, inhuman sounds, a chorus of agony and hunger. "Get back!" Jake yelled, but his voice was drowned by the rising chaos. Shadows wrapped around him, pulling him into the darkness. He clawed at the air, screaming as his figure was swallowed whole. "No!" I cried, grabbing Emily's arm as we stumbled backward, but the shadows had already reached her. She fought, pushing at the inky tendrils that coiled around her, but her screams were cut short. I couldn't breathe. The cold seeped into my bones and the whispers filled my head. Alone. Forever alone. The meadow had consumed them all. I was the last to fall. When I woke, the meadow was still. The fire had burned out, leaving only ashes behind. The tents were gone. There was nothing but the silence of an empty, forgotten space where no one else would ever return. It was late afternoon when we arrived. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the overgrown paths and broken fountains of the abandoned garden. The air was thick with the scent of decay and wildflowers gone wild. My friends and I had stumbled upon it while exploring the outskirts of an old, forgotten town. No one had lived there for years, yet the garden still retained its eerie beauty. The wrought iron gate, heavily rusted, stood slightly ajar, creaking softly with every gust of wind. Beyond it, the garden spread out, a tangled mess of weeds, twisted trees, and stone statues half buried in moss. It was a place long forgotten by time, untouched by human hands for decades. We stepped inside, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound. As we walked along the gravel paths, the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. The air grew colder with every step, and the once tranquil atmosphere took on a sinister edge. There were no birds, no animals, just an unnatural silence, as though the garden itself was holding its breath. "Let's split up," Jessica said, always eager for adventure. "We'll cover more ground." "Are you crazy?" Mark snapped, his voice low and uneasy. "We don't know what's in here." "It's fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll stick together for now." But curiosity pushed us forward. We explored the garden's depths, deeper than we ever intended. The statues lining the paths were disturbing, weathered faces twisted into grotesque expressions, some with hollow eyes where stone had crumbled away. Their silent stares followed us wherever we went. Suddenly, we stumbled upon a patch of dirt where nothing grew. It was unnatural, completely barren except for a single stone pedestal, weathered by time. Resting atop it was an open book bound. In dark leather, its pages yellowed and torn. "We can't just leave it here," Jessica said, reaching for the book. "It might be important." "No," Mark said sharply. "We shouldn't touch it." But Jessica had already lifted it. The weight felt wrong, too heavy for its size, and the moment her fingers brushed the pages, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The words inside were cryptic and ancient, detailing rituals and symbols that sent an uneasy feeling crawling through her mind. The whispers started then, a soft, distant murmur in the corners of our ears. At first, it was just a hum, but it grew louder with each passing second. The statues around us seemed to move slightly, their stone eyes twitching with life. The feeling that we were no longer alone was undeniable. "Put it down," Mark urged, grabbing Jessica's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as we hurried to move away, the wind picked up suddenly, gusting violently, sending leaves flying. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices merging into one, screaming in languages we couldn't comprehend. Shadows swirled around us, encroaching from every direction, their forms flickering between human and something far darker. Jessica dropped the book, stumbling backward. Mark grabbed her, pulling her into a run, but the garden seemed to stretch, impossibly. The paths warped, twisting into impossible shapes. We couldn't see the gate anymore, or even where we had entered. The garden was endless, a labyrinth of madness. "Where are we?" Jessica cried, her voice frantic. "Just keep running," I yelled back, but panic had taken hold of us all. The statues began to rise fully, their forms shifting into something grotesque and inhuman. They didn't speak, but their hollow eyes glowed with a malevolent light. They moved toward us silently, their feet barely touching the ground. We were surrounded. Every direction we looked was filled with darkness. The whispers became deafening, a chorus of agony that consumed our senses. Suddenly, a voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Leave!" The statues froze mid-step, their forms twisting back into stone. The wind stilled. The whispers ceased. We stood motionless, unable to breathe, unable to speak, and then, as quickly as it had started, the garden fell into a deathly silence once more. The book lay open on the stone pedestal. The leather was unblemished, the pages blank. Without a word, we turned and ran. It was a rainy evening when the bus dropped me off at the last stop. I was the only passenger, and the town seemed desolate in the fading light. The rain had picked up, drenching the empty streets in glistening reflections. I glanced around, hoping for some sign of life, but there was nothing, just the sound of the rain on the pavement. The bus rumbled away, leaving me alone at the stop. The old metal shelter creaked in the wind, the rusted roof sagging slightly. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising, given how remote this place was. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no idea how I would get back once night fully set in. A shiver ran down my spine as I looked up and saw the streetlights flicker, dimming to a dull glow. I turned back to the shelter, seeking shelter from the relentless rain. That's when I heard it. A soft, hollow tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the rain. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like something was tapping against the glass of the bus shelter. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Nobody else was there. The tapping continued. My heart pounded harder, and I felt the cold creeping into my bones. I stepped back from the shelter, my gaze darting to the surrounding streets. There was nothing but darkness, no cars, no distant lights, no movement. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. A breath escaped my lips as I exhaled a shaky sigh. I tried to convince myself it had been the rain or my imagination. But then the faint sound returned. Not on the glass this time, but from inside the shelter itself. It wasn't tapping. It was breathing. A low, rasping inhale echoed softly in the confined space. My breath hitched and I backed away, my back hitting the cold metal wall. My legs felt frozen, and panic began to surge through me. The shelter seemed to close in around me, the shadows shifting unnaturally, stretching toward me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. Just the rhythmic breathing, steady, uneven. The rain pounded louder now, filling the air with a steady roar, but beneath it, I could still hear the breath. Suddenly, the flickering streetlights shut off, completely, plunging the stop into complete darkness. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hands. The breathing stopped. A terrifying stillness fell over me. Then I heard a voice, a faint, distorted whisper so close to my ear that I could feel its chill. "Why did you stay?" The question reverberated through my skull, deep and echoing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Panic surged through my body as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. A single drop of rain fell onto my cheek, cold and wet. And then another, and another, until the entire world felt like it was drowning in darkness. The shelter was gone, the bus stop lost to the void. The GPS had failed hours ago, and the four of us were hopelessly lost. The back roads wound endlessly through unfamiliar woods, the dense trees blotting out the moonlight. What had started as a fun weekend road trip had turned into something else, entirely. A frantic attempt to find our way back to civilization. As the car rolled along the cracked asphalt, a strange fog began to rise. It clung low to the ground, unnervingly thick, swallowing the road behind us. We hadn't passed another car in miles, and the deeper we went, the more the road seemed to deteriorate. Broken pavement, overgrown weeds creeping up the edges, and signs rusted beyond recognition. "Are we even going the right way?" Claire asked from the passenger seat, her voice strained. "I don't know," I admitted. "But turning back won't help. We have to keep going until we hit a main road." The others in the back, Mike and Tara, were unusually quiet. None of Idus said it aloud, but we all felt it. The oppressive weight of the woods pressing in, the silence broken only by the occasional snap of a branch in the darkness. After another hour of driving, we saw a sign. It was old, the paint faded, but it pointed to a town we'd never heard of. Relieved, we decided to follow it. The road narrowed as we continued, the trees growing denser until they seemed to form a tunnel around us. Then, the headlights flickered. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered. Before I could answer, the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in suffocating darkness. I turned the key again, but the car refused to start. Mike groaned from the back seat. "Great. What now?" "We'll check it out," I said, though my voice was far from confident. Claire and I stepped out, the cold air biting at our skin. The fog was thicker now, swirling around our ankles. The forest beyond the road was unnaturally still. No wind, no chirping insects, nothing. As I opened the hood, Claire grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" It was faint at first, a distant humming sound like static on a television. It grew louder, more distinct, until it became clear. A voice, low and guttural, calling out from the woods. "Hello?" Claire called, her voice trembling. I grabbed her hand. "Don't." But then it happened. Shapes began to emerge from the fog. At first, they were faint, like shadows cast by an unseen light. But as they drew closer, I realized they weren't human. Their forms were twisted and wrong, elongated limbs, hollowed faces, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Claire screamed, and we bolted back to the car. I pounded on the windows. "Mike, Tara, unlock the doors." But when we climbed back, the back seat was empty. Where are they?" Claire stammered. "They were just here," I yelled, panic rising. The shadows surrounded the car now, pressing against the windows. Their faces, if you could call them that, were just inches from the glass, staring in with an unnatural hunger. The car groaned as though the weight of their presence was too much for it to bear. Then, all at once, they vanished. I turned the key in desperation, and the car roared to life. Without thinking, I floored the gas, swerving around the fog and speeding down the road. Claire clutched my arm, tears streaming down her face. "Where's Mike? Where's Tara?" "I don't know," I shouted. The road stretched on, endless and dark. We drove for what felt like hours, the forest never thinning, the fog never lifting. When we finally stopped, the car was nearly out of gas, and there was no sign of any town. We never found Mike or Tara. The police dismissed our story, chalking it up to exhaustion and stress. But Claire and I know the truth. Whatever we saw that night, it wasn't human. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I swear I see shapes in the fog watching, waiting. It was supposed to be a quick hike, a way to get away from the noise of the city for a few hours. My friends and I drove out to a remote trailhead, deep into a dense forest that few people ever visited. The trees were tall, their branches forming a canopy overhead, casting the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. We didn't realize just how isolated we'd be until we were miles from the nearest road. The hike started off peaceful enough. The forest was quiet, save for the soft crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional bird call. But as the sun began to dip lower, a strange unease crept in. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows between the trees grew, deeper with every step. "Are we sure we're still on the trail?" Jessica asked, her voice tense. "I think so," I replied, though doubt flickered in my mind. The trail markers had become sporadic, hidden under thick brush. The path ahead appeared untouched, as if the forest had reclaimed it. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No more birdsong, no rustling of animals, just silence. It was unnatural, almost suffocating. The wind stirred the trees, but there was no sound, just a faint whisper that seemed to float through the branches. A voice, hushed, distant, repeating the same 3 words. "Follow. Follow. Follow." "Did you hear that?" Sean asked, his voice shaking. I nodded slowly, gripping my flashlight tighter. The whisper didn't seem to come from any particular direction. It seemed to echo all around us, carried by the very trees themselves. Suddenly, the forest shifted. Shapes moved at the edge of the light from our flashlights, things that weren't quite human, their forms indistinct and shifting. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, slithering toward us. "Let's get out of here," Jessica cried, her voice cracking as we started running back the way we came. But the forest seemed to shift with us. Every direction we turned, the path was unfamiliar, a maze of trees and darkness where nothing was certain. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Stay together," I yelled, my breath coming in short gasps. The flashlight flickered, then went out entirely. Panic surged through us as we stumbled in darkness, following only the sound of each other's hurried footsteps. Suddenly, we stopped. Before us was a figure, a tall, shadowy figure, humanoid but not entirely human. Its limbs were elongated, distorted, and its face was a void, hollow and void of features. It stood motionless, silent, as if waiting. "Run!" Sean screamed, shoving Jessica into motion. We bolted, pushing through the trees as fast as we could. The creature followed, its presence stretching and distorting the very air around us. With every breath, we felt more disoriented, as though we were losing our way faster with each step. We didn't know if we were running toward safety or deeper into the trap. The whispers had become deafening, suffocating, an endless chant of "follow, follow," that threatened to consume us entirely. And then, without warning, we broke through a clearing, a familiar spot. The trail markers had been there all along, hidden beneath the underbrush. We collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, as the figure vanished into the shadows. The forest fell silent again, and it stayed. That way, we didn't speak, we didn't dare. It all started with an old mirror. I found it at a thrift store, hidden away in the corner behind dusty glassware and forgotten books. The frame was ornate, carved with swirling patterns that looked like faces, and the glass itself had a faint, eerie shimmer. Something about it drew me in, despite the warning I felt deep down. At first, it hung on the wall in my bedroom, reflecting the room just fine. But after a few nights, strange things began happening. The reflection wasn't always the same. Sometimes I'd see figures moving in the background, shadows that weren't there in real life. The mirror seemed to distort reality, bending light and angles in ways I couldn't explain. One evening, I was getting ready for bed when I noticed a new detail. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just showing the room. It was showing something else. Behind my bed, a door appeared, solid wood with a brass handle. I spun around, but there was no door, just my plain wall. Frightened, I tried to remove the mirror, but it wouldn't budge from the wall. My hands trembled as I examined the glass again. A faint scratching noise came from inside it, a low, deliberate sound, like nails dragging slowly across the surface. I could barely hear it over the beating of my heart. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel eyes watching me from within the mirror. Shadows flickered in the corners, and I heard whispers, soft and insistent, calling out my name. In the morning, I covered the mirror with a sheet, desperate to block its gaze. But when I peeked under the fabric, the reflection was still there, unchanged. Worse, my reflection was no longer alone. The shadows had crept into it, crowding around me, their distorted faces pressed close against the glass. Weeks passed, and things only worsened. My friends noticed that I wasn't the same. Tired, pale, and distant. They begged me to remove the mirror, but it was like it had fused with the wall. Even when I destroyed the frame, the glass wouldn't shatter. It stayed intact, pulsing faintly like something alive beneath the surface. One day, while cleaning the remnants, I noticed a faint message etched into the glass. "You let me in," it said, written in thin, ghostly script. That night, the mirror whispered once more, "I'm here." And I knew then I could never escape. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the edge of the forest, a dense, ancient expanse stretching far beyond what we could see. My friends and I were on a camping trip, seeking adventure away from the familiar world. The air was crisp, and the sun pierced through the canopy in sporadic beams. The forest seemed peaceful, but something felt off. We set up our tents near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees with gnarled branches. The sounds of nature were soothing at first, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a bird. But as night approached, a strange stillness settled in. The woods were silent, almost too quiet, as though even the animals avoided the area. As we sat around the fire, eating our meals, we began to notice the whispers. At first, it was faint, a distant murmur like the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct. Words we couldn't quite make out, voices we couldn't pinpoint. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," I said, though my stomach churned with unease. "Just the wind." But the wind didn't explain the chilling way the whispers seemed to form sentences. Phrases like, "You shouldn't have come," and "leave," floated through the air, winding between the trees. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually grew louder. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to ignore the eerie sounds. But no matter how loudly we talked or laughed, the whispers never ceased. They followed us, weaving through the branches, becoming louder with every passing minute. Suddenly, one of my friends, Marcus, shouted, "Stop! Stop whispering!" His voice echoed through the still night. The whispers paused, and for a moment, the woods felt utterly silent. But then they came back, closer now, more desperate. They weren't just voices anymore. They were inhuman, guttural, almost like something wrong. I scrambled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed, their twisted shapes casting unnaturally long shadows. The whispers became screams, not of rage or anger, but of despair, a haunting chorus of agony and sorrow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire flickered violently, almost dying out as though being consumed by the darkness. Panic surged through us. Emily screamed, dropping her belongings as we rushed toward the tents. We couldn't run. Our feet seemed rooted to the ground. The whispers intensified into deafening howls, and something slithered through the edges of the light, dark shapes twisting in and out of view. The forest seemed alive. its branches stretched, its roots pulling at the earth as though reaching for something hidden. I turned back to the clearing, gasping for breath, and saw it, a silhouette, pale and gaunt, standing just beyond the edge of the light. Its eyes were hollow, voids of blackness staring into my soul. "Leave," it hissed, and its voice was not human, not animal, something far worse. It wasn't a sound at all, but a presence, a force so malevolent it tore through the very fabric of reality. A blinding light erupted from my flashlight as I screamed, and in that moment of pure terror, everything vanished. When I awoke, the fire had gone out. My friends were gone. The whispers still echo in my mind. It started as a simple renovation project. We were fixing up an old farmhouse we had recently purchased. The house had character, creaky wooden floors, antique fixtures, and a sprawling, overgrown yard. But beneath the charm lay something unsettling. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. The wooden stairs creaked as we descended, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. My flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the faint hum of the old flickering bulbs above did little to illuminate the space. Boxes lined the walls, some filled with forgotten family heirlooms, others with items that hadn't been touched in decades. The deeper we went, the colder it became, until a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel when exposed to the elements. It was something more unnatural, something that settled in your bones. Then, in the farthest corner, we found it, a wooden door, unmarked, almost hidden by the layers of dust and cobwebs. The handle was rusted, nearly falling off when I touched it. My curiosity got the better of me. With a hesitant push, the door creaked open. Beyond was a room we hadn't expected, a strange, sterile space that felt disconnected from the rest of the basement. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, iron examination tables, forgotten, syringes, and cabinets filled with jars of specimens preserved in formaldehyde. It looked more like a clinic from another era, abandoned and untouched by time. "That can't be right," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. My flashlight flickered, once more casting unsettling shadows against the walls. The glass containers held twisted, lifeless shapes. A malformed fetus, misshapen limbs, and something that looked far too human. The specimens seemed to pulse ever so slightly, like they were breathing, their glassy eyes reflecting back at us. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the basement, trapping us in darkness. Whispers filled the air, soft, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Stay," they hissed. "Stay." Fear gripped us, our breaths coming in short, gasps as the air grew colder still. My flashlight was useless now, its beam barely illuminating the faint outlines of the grotesque figures in the jars. The whispers grew louder, morphing into something menacing, a chorus of voices, distorted and pleading. Suddenly, the medical equipment around us began to move. Tables shaking, cabinets sliding open on their own, and the jars tilting as if something unseen was shifting inside them. The specimens writhed, their features twisting into unnatural forms. I could barely scream as I felt something brush against my hand, a cold, bony finger wrapping around mine. In that moment, the voices screamed, inside my head, "You shouldn't have come here." The room dissolved into madness and darkness consumed everything. It was late evening when we left the small town behind. The sun had long since set, leaving the horizon a dull orange glow as we drove down the winding country road. The headlights barely cut through the dense trees lining either side, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and pine. Just a few of us had decided on this spontaneous road trip. My best friend Rachel sat beside me in the passenger seat, while our two friends, Ben and Lisa, followed behind in a separate car. The road had been quiet for miles. No other cars, no signs of life. The distant hum of cicadas was the only sound. "It's getting darker," Rachel said, her voice tense. "Maybe we should stop soon." "We're fine," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "There's a small town up ahead, right?" I checked the GPS again, but the signal had been spotty for the last hour. It kept flashing between bars, as though the road itself was swallowing the signal. I sighed, turning the volume down on the radio. Static hissed, occasionally punctuated by distant whispers I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, the car jolted slightly. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop on the side of the road. "What the hell?" I whispered, looking down at the dashboard. A deep scratch ran along the side of the car, an unnatural, jagged mark. "What was that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. We both stepped out of the car to inspect the damage. Nothing was visible in the darkness. No branches, no debris, just the scratch. "Must have been a rock or something," I said, though I wasn't convinced. As we stood there, I noticed Ben and Lisa's car pulling up behind us. They were clearly shaken, too. "We saw something," Lisa said quietly, her voice shaking. "On the road. A figure, walking slowly. But there was nothing there when we checked." Rachel and I exchanged a glance, uneasy. The silence seemed to deepen again. The trees seemed to close in, shadows twisting unnaturally as the wind rustled through the leaves. "Let's just keep moving," I urged, though I wasn't sure if that was the right decision. The road ahead was even darker, more isolated. We drove in tense silence, but no matter how far we went, it felt like we were going in circles. The road didn't seem to end. The GPS was completely frozen now, the screen showing a blank map with no roads, no towns, just an endless expanse of black. Every now and then, we caught glimpses of something at the edge of the headlights, a shadow, a silhouette, fleeting and elusive, barely discernible before vanishing completely. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching. "Did you see that?" Rachel asked, gripping my arm tightly as we passed a bend. Her voice shook. I didn't need to ask what she was talking about. Every turn, every glance into the rearview mirror was met with unease. Finally, the road straightened out and there was a slight incline ahead. The headlights flickered again as we crested the hill, and that's when we saw it, the figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was too tall, too thin, and the features were distorted, lacking a clear face, just an empty, shifting void. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like something inhuman was attempting to walk forward. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The figure loomed closer, stepping toward us. We could feel its presence, almost tangible in the suffocating air. The static on the radio surged louder, an inhuman scream cutting through the noise before fading again into eerie silence. "We have to get out of here," I managed to say, my voice a whisper. My hands were trembling as I put the car in reverse, tires squealing as I sped backward. The figure didn't follow, at least not immediately, but the fear that it was still there, waiting in the darkness, haunted us. We didn't stop until we found a small roadside motel, miles down the highway. The place was no safer. Creaky floors, flickering lights, and an air of oppressive stillness. But we didn't care. We just needed to put distance between us and whatever we saw. To this day, we have no explanation for what happened on that road. The memory haunts us, an endless, silent expanse of darkness and something beyond our understanding. It started on a lonely highway, the kind where the horizon stretches forever, and the stars above are brighter than the taillights in front of you. I'd been driving for hours that night, making my way home after a weekend visit with friends. The radio was off, my phone was dead, and the only sound was the low hum of the tires on asphalt. Somewhere around mile marker 116, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They were distant at first, faint pinpricks on the horizon, but as I glanced back, they seemed to be closing in faster than they should. a little too fast. I kept driving, telling myself it was probably just someone speeding. But the headlights grew brighter and brighter until they were nearly blinding, tailing me aggressively. My pulse quickened as the car behind me swerved slightly as if trying to pass, then fell back, only to repeat the motion seconds later. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off, but they didn't. Instead, their car pulled up beside me, matching my speed. Through my peripheral vision, I could see the vehicle, a black sedan, its windows dark and impossible to see through. I glanced over, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver, but there was no one inside. The steering wheel moved on its own, the car swerving closer to mine. My heart pounded as I gripped the wheel tighter, accelerating in a panic. The black sedan followed, its engine roaring louder than my own. "Leave me alone," I yelled, though no one could hear me. Suddenly, the sedan shot forward, cutting me off and forcing me to slam on the brakes. My car skidded, tires screeching, as I came to a halt in the middle of the highway. The black sedan idled in front of me for a moment, its taillights glowing like red eyes in the darkness. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it sped off into the distance, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a moment, my chest heaving, trying to collect myself. The highway was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I checked the time on the dashboard. It was just past 1 a.m. I told myself it was over, just some kind of bizarre road rage incident. Shaking, I pulled back onto the road and continued, driving. A few miles later, I saw something in the distance. My stomach dropped as I realized it was the black sedan, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed instinctively, unsure of what to do. As I passed, I craned my neck to look inside the car. It was empty. No driver, no passengers, nothing. I didn't wait to figure it out. My foot slammed on the gas, the car roaring as I sped away. But the moment I looked in my rearview mirror, the headlights were back. They had appeared from nowhere, closer than before, and they were gaining on me fast. The next few minutes were a blur of panic. I weaved in and out of lanes, trying to lose the car, but it was relentless, always inches behind me. My speedometer climbed past 90, then 100, the road a black ribbon stretching endlessly ahead. Then, without warning, the headlights vanished. Let out a shaky breath, thinking it was finally over, but I was wrong. The air in my car turned ice cold, my breath visible in the sudden chill. A foul smell filled the cabin, like burnt rubber and decay. My radio, though it was off, began to hiss with static. "Why are you running?" A voice crackled through the speakers, low, guttural, and not human. I froze, my hands trembling on the wheel. The voice came again, louder this time. "You can't escape." My rearview mirror showed something I'll never forget. A shadowy figure sitting in my back seat, its face obscured, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I swerved violently, nearly losing control of the car. When I looked back, it was gone. The highway stretched on, empty and endless. I drove for hours, afraid to stop, afraid to look anywhere but straight ahead. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a gas station and stumbled out of the car, shaking. The attendant looked up from the counter, startled by my appearance. "Rough night?" he asked. I nodded, too rattled to explain. As I turned back to the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the dusty rear window, someone, or something, had written a single word from the inside. "Soon." It was an ordinary evening when my husband and I decided to take a walk through the woods near our new home. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. We had moved here just a few weeks ago, and the quiet seclusion had been one of the main reasons for choosing this area. The woods were vast, with tall, twisted trees stretching toward the sky. We followed a narrow path that curved around a small, stagnant pond. The air was cool and still, and everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was strange how the forest seemed to absorb sound, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. "We should turn back soon," I said, squeezing my husband's hand. His grip tightened slightly as we moved deeper into the shadows. Suddenly, we heard a faint humming. It wasn't coming from any direction we could identify. It was low, rhythmic, like a chant that seemed to pulse in sync with the trees. The air grew colder, heavier, and I began to feel uneasy. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," my husband replied, his voice strained. The humming grew louder. It was like a song we couldn't understand, the words slithering around in the darkness. We paused, holding our breath, listening. The forest seemed alive, too alive. Every shadow moved slightly, shifting shapes that were impossible to make out. Suddenly, the path ahead seemed to narrow, the trees closing in on us. The woods felt like a living, breathing entity, and we were lost within it. My phone had no signal, and the sky had turned an unnatural shade of deep blue. A low growl echoed behind us. My husband turned quickly, flashlight raised, but there was nothing there, just more trees. Yet the sound continued, closer now, a raspy, guttural sound that chilled my bones. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, urgency thick in his even voice. We started walking faster, the hum still surrounding us, getting louder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the cold hands of fear gripping at my throat. Then I saw it. A figure. Tall, shadowy, and humanoid, standing at the edge of the trail. Its eyes glowed faintly, a pale, unnatural light cutting through the darkness. I stopped, frozen, unable to move. My husband called my name, his voice distant as if underwater. The figure began to move, slowly at first, its long, thin arms extending toward us. The humming reached a fever pitch, vibrating in the air like a symphony of madness. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred as if something was bending reality itself around us. "Run!" my husband yelled, yanking me forward. We sprinted through the woods, the figure always just behind us, its presence closing in. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, hear its whispering voice in my mind. "You're mine now." We didn't stop. The path twisted and turned endlessly, but somehow we kept moving forward. The humming finally faded, and the creature's presence slowly receded, retreating back into the shadows. Breathless and trembling, we broke through the tree line into the clearing near the pond. The sound of the forest was gone, leaving only the distant croak of a frog. My husband dropped to his knees, gasping for air, as I collapsed beside him. What was that?" I whispered. He shook his head, eyes wide. "Something we shouldn't have found." The hollow woods were still. It started as a peaceful getaway. My girlfriend and I had rented a secluded cottage in the countryside, a charming old place surrounded by rolling hills and a garden that stretched far beyond the property's boundaries. The garden was beautiful. At first glance, wildflowers in full bloom, a stone path winding its way through thick hedges, and an ancient, twisted tree at its center. But as night fell, something shifted. We explored the garden that afternoon, wandering through rows of overgrown plants. There was a strange sense of timelessness, as though the garden wasn't part of the present day. The air grew cooler, and the silence became suffocating. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the hum of insects in the distance. That evening, as we sat on the cottage porch, the sun dipped below the horizon. The garden, once beautiful, began to look eerie. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence deepened into a haunting stillness. My phone had no signal, and the cottage lights flickered faintly whenever a breeze passed through. "We should head back in," I said, my voice a little shaky. My girlfriend nodded, but as we rose to leave, a low, guttural whisper floated through. "The garden." "Stay," it said, smooth and menacing. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My girlfriend clutched my arm tightly, her breath hitching. "Did you hear that?" I think it's the wind," I managed to say, but even as I spoke, we both knew it wasn't. The whisper came again, this time louder, deeper. It seemed to come from the twisted tree at the garden's center. "Stay with me." Fear gripped us both as we stumbled back toward the cottage. The path behind us was overrun with vines, the trees seeming to lean in closer, their branches clawing toward us. The garden's beauty had become something grotesque, a maze of shadows, shifting shapes hidden just beyond sight. Inside the cottage, the windows were locked, the doors secured, but we could still hear it, faint breathing from beyond the walls, hollow laughter, and the whisper of "stay." "We need to get out," I whispered urgently, my voice trembling. The lights flickered again, this time fading entirely. The whispers intensified, louder and more desperate. Suddenly, we heard it, an unnatural sound, as if something was moving inside the walls, slithering through the wood like a predator. The cottage shook slightly as if the garden itself was reaching for us. The whispers became frantic, almost pleading. "I won't let you leave," a voice echoed, low, sinister, almost familiar. Panic overtook us. My girlfriend screamed as we slammed open the front door and sprinted back toward the car. The garden was alive, twisting, moving, and snarling in the dark. The ancient tree seemed to loom over us, its branches writhing like dark, clawed tendrils. As we tore down the driveway, the garden shrunk behind us, retreating into the shadows. But we knew it was still there, watching, waiting. It was an old farmhouse, sitting far from any modern conveniences. My family had moved in after the previous owner passed away, and the house had been untouched for years. The place had its charm: antique furniture, wooden floors, and that strange, musty smell. But something about the basement unsettled me from the start. The door to the cellar was small, barely noticeable at the base of the staircase. It was hidden under a thin rug and secured with a rusted metal latch. My father would sometimes go down there to retrieve canned goods or check the water pump, but he always insisted it wasn't worth exploring further. "Nothing down there, but old junk," he'd say with a dismissive wave. But curiosity got the better of me. One rainy evening, when the house creaked with every gust of wind, I decided to investigate. The cellar was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserved vegetables and dusty tools from decades ago. In the corner stood a wooden chair, nothing special really, except it seemed out of place. The air was damp, heavy, and the silence was almost suffocating. Every time the wind blew, it whistled through unseen cracks, creating a haunting, rhythmic sound. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the far end of the cellar, beyond the shelves, there was another door, one I had never seen before. It was painted black, its edges worn as if dragged through the earth itself. It had no handle, no visible lock, only a faint impression as though it had been designed to blend in with the stone wall. I walked toward it slowly, my breath fogging in the cold air. Something felt wrong. The closer I got, the harder it became to move. My limbs felt heavy, like I was walking through water. Suddenly, the bulb above flickered out entirely, plunging the cellar into darkness. A low whispering began, voices, distant and indistinct, brushing against my ears. They spoke words I couldn't quite hear, and yet I knew they weren't benign. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely audible. The whispering stopped. I reached out toward the black door, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. There was a texture, as though the door wasn't wood at all, but something far more ancient and unnatural. I pushed against it, though it didn't budge. It felt as if it wasn't meant to be opened. meant to remain hidden forever. I backed away slowly, the whispering beginning again, but louder this time. The voices weren't just speaking anymore, they were chanting, low and rhythmic, as if a chant rising from deep within the earth itself. The temperature dropped rapidly, and an oppressive weight settled on my chest. The air grew thick with something otherworldly. Panic gripped me. I reached blindly for my flashlight, turning it, on just in time to see the black door shift. It didn't move outward. It shifted inward, melting into the wall as if swallowing itself. And then, it wasn't a door anymore. It was a void that stretched endlessly into darkness, shifting and writhing like a living thing. The whispering grew louder, morphing into a chorus of voices, some crying, some laughing, each sound hauntingly, familiar, yet alien. My breath hitched, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise, a low, guttural whisper right in my ear. "You should have left it alone," I screamed as the void surged toward me, pulling me into the darkness. The building had been empty for years, a relic of a bygone era. My friend Kate and I had rented the attic apartment for a month to escape the city, seeking peace and solitude. The place had a certain charm: wooden beams, old creaking floors, and tall windows that overlooked a quiet street. At first, everything seemed fine. The mornings were calm, with the sun filtering through dust-filled air. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to surface. Small things at first: a door closing by itself, shadows flickering across the room when no one else was moving. We attributed them to the creaking old house settling, chalking it up to the creaky floorboards and drafty windows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard a soft tapping. Repeated, deliberate. Kate opened the door to check, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. "I swear," Kate whispered, "someone was knocking." "We're just being paranoid," I said, trying to calm her nerves. "It's an old place. Noise travels." But that night, the tapping returned, this time louder. It came from the attic door itself. The sound echoed through the small apartment, making the walls seem alive. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. No response. Kate had gone to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting on the other side. The following days only intensified the strange occurrences. At night, the temperature dropped unnaturally low. The old radiator whistled with a low, unsettling hum, while the sound of footsteps seemed to walk across the attic floor, light, hesitant, as if something was pacing back and forth. One afternoon, I decided to investigate further. Kate was out running errands and the apartment was silent. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the attic was in darkness. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I flicked on my flashlight, revealing a dusty, sparsely furnished room. Furniture was draped in white sheets, and the only sound was my breathing. The walls were lined with old photos, hundreds of them. Faces stared back at me, some smiling, some hauntingly vacant. But what disturbed me most was that the eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. The tapping started again, louder, from inside the room. I froze. "Kate?" I called out, but there was no response. I pressed forward, lifting one of the sheets covering a chair. Beneath it sat an old, antique camera, its lens fixed towards the far wall. Dust coated the lens, but when I moved closer, the faint image of a face appeared, one I couldn't recognize. The tapping grew louder, erratic. The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure against my chest, an unseen weight, as though something was pushing down on me. I turned to leave, but as I opened the door, it slammed shut behind me. The room flickered in and out of sight, shadows dancing across the floor, and then I saw it, a figure, standing in the corner, its face hidden beneath. A tattered hood, I screamed, unable to move. The figure raised its hand, revealing dark, lifeless eyes beneath the hood. The tapping stopped. Suddenly, the attic door burst open and Kate rushed in. "What's happening?" she cried. The figure vanished into the shadows, and the attic was still once more. What was that?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Kate said, her eyes wide. "But we need to get out of here." We left the apartment, leaving the door wide open behind us. The strange presence never returned, but to this day, I can't forget the sound of that tapping, its rhythm echoing in my mind. It was supposed to be a simple journey home. The last train had been delayed by hours, and by the time I boarded, the station was nearly empty. The train was old, creaking, with flickering lights overhead and a heavy atmosphere that hung in, the air like a thick fog. I found a seat in the farthest corner, away from everyone else. The train rattled forward into the night, its rhythmic clatter calming at first, but then something changed. The silence began to creep in, almost unnatural. The occasional hum of the wheels and the faint murmur of the engine seemed to fall into a rhythm. Too perfect, too quiet. The few other passengers on board were scattered along the train, but their faces were shadowed by the dim light. They sat motionless, staring ahead, their expressions blank. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing at the other passengers. Their lack of movement unnerved me more than the silence. At the next stop, I noticed something odd. The train didn't slow down. It kept moving forward as if the station didn't exist. Panic began to set in, but before I could react, the doors shut behind me with a loud hiss, locking me inside. The conductor was nowhere to be found. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty car. No response, only the rhythmic hum of the train and the faint creak of the wheels. I tried to call my family, but there was no signal. My phone buzzed weakly, then died completely. I sat back down, my hands trembling as the train accelerated into complete darkness. There were no more stations ahead, just endless tracks stretching into the unknown. A chill ran down my spine as the figure appeared, just at the end of the car where the next compartment began. It was tall, gaunt, and silent. No face, just a featureless void where its head should have been. Shadows clung to its limbs, unnatural and shifting with each movement. "Who? What are you?" I whispered, pressing myself against the window, but the creature didn't answer. Its form seemed to phase through the train's walls as it glided closer. My breath quickened, the air thickening with dread. I could hear the low, dragging sound of its footsteps against the floor, silent yet menacing. I reached for my flashlight, again flicking it on. The beam barely illuminated the creature before it flickered out entirely, leaving me in darkness. Panic surged through me. The train kept moving faster, the world beyond the windows a blur of night and iron. Every sound, the hum of the train, the creak of metal, grew louder, distorted. The passengers remained frozen, their empty gazes directed forward. "Help me," I shouted, voice breaking as the figure loomed closer. I could feel its cold presence at my side, its shadow casting over me like a suffocating shroud. My hands trembled as I grasped for my phone, desperately trying to call someone, anyone, but the screen remained black. Suddenly, the train's lights went out completely. The darkness was total, smothering. I couldn't see anything. My breath was shallow, a sob threatening to break free. The creature stood beside me, its presence so overwhelming that I felt my mind slipping away. A voice whispered into my ear, a voice without words, without meaning, but its tone resonated deep in my soul. "We're the last." The town had long forgotten about the old toy shop. It sat on the edge of a narrow, winding street, its windows covered in dust, the faded sign barely hanging by a rusted hinge. No one ventured there anymore. The stories had spread long ago. Whispers of toys coming to life in the dead of night, Their giggles heard when the shop was empty, but no one believed them. Until now. It was just supposed to be a quick visit. My cousin, Alex, and I had stumbled upon the shop while wandering through the town. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, a mix of old wood and forgotten memories. I pushed open the door. It creaked loudly like a scream echoing through the stillness. Inside, the place was a maze of shelves stacked with toys. Dolls, wooden, soldiers, stuffed animals, all worn and broken in strange ways. The lighting was dim, flickering as if uncertain whether it wanted to work. "This place is creepy," Alex whispered, his voice echoing against the silent walls. "No one's been here for years," I said. "It's just old." We moved cautiously through the aisles, checking each toy. Many were missing limbs, their expressions contorted into strange, unnerving smiles. One doll had cracked porcelain skin, its hollow eyes staring directly at us. Another, a clown figure, had a red nose that seemed to drip slowly with something dark, possibly paint or something worse. Then we heard the first giggle, a soft, high-pitched laugh echoing through the shop. "Did you hear that?" Alex's voice shook. I nodded, but no words came out. It had sounded close, like it had come from behind us. But when we turned, there was nothing. Only the lifeless toys, their glassy eyes following us in the dim light. "Let's get out of here," I said, my breath quickening. But as we made our way toward the door, it slammed shut behind us. I yelped, spinning around. The shop was darker, now. Too dark. The flickering lights went out completely. We were plunged into absolute silence, save for the soft creaks of wooden shelves settling. Another giggle, louder this time, rose up in the shadows. It seemed to come from everywhere. The toys on the shelves began to move, slightly at first, a doll's arm twitching, a small bear shifting its head. But then they began to move more deliberately. "Stay still," Alex whispered, panic clear, in his voice. The clown doll turned its head fully toward us, its painted grin widening. The wooden soldiers lined up on the shelves shifted into a formation, as though preparing for battle. "We have to get out," I said again, my voice cracking. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on, but it barely illuminated the shop. The shadows moved faster now, darting between the aisles, more giggles rising from unseen corners. "Where's the exit?" Alex shouted, his flashlight flaring briefly before dying. Suddenly, from behind us, the sound of tiny footsteps echoed. I spun around just in time to see the smallest of the dolls, a porcelain boy, its cracked face tilted up toward us, its tiny chipped lips forming words. "Play with us," it said in a voice so soft it made my skin crawl. "No," I screamed, backing into a shelf. The toys surged forward, dolls clattering off shelves, bears waddling across the floor, and even smaller, shadowy figures emerging from the corners, their twisted faces grimacing with delight. The giggles turned into a chorus, louder and more chilling as they surrounded us. Every direction we turned, there were more of them, living shadows with cracked, lifeless eyes. Then the clown's voice boomed above the others. "Play. Forever." My heart raced as Alex and I pushed against the door, throwing all our weight into it. The giggles grew deafening, filling every inch of the shop. We didn't dare look back. Finally, the door gave way and we stumbled into the street. The shop was still there, still dark, but no movement. The toys remained frozen, lifeless. Once more, we didn't wait to see if they would wake again. Breathing hard, we ran. Down the street, past the empty houses, away from the forgotten toy shop that would haunt our memories forever. We were lucky to escape. But the shop, it still stands. Waiting. Always waiting. It had been years since anyone had dared venture near the old well at the edge of town. The stories surrounding it were whispered among the locals. Tales of strange sounds, vanished hikers, and eerie lights that flickered in the dead of night. Most people avoided the well, not out of fear, but out of respect for the ominous legends. But curiosity got the better of me. One late autumn evening, after hearing so many eerie tales, I decided to visit the well alone. My friends had all warned me not to go, but I couldn't resist. The town's ancient history called to me, and the thought of uncovering some forgotten mystery was too tempting. The path to the well was overgrown, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and twisted roots. Darkness cloaked the forest, the trees leaning in like they had stories to tell. It was cold, so cold that even my breath formed thick clouds in the air. The faint glimmer of the well came into view as I pushed my way through the underbrush. Well itself was old, crumbling stone with a rusted metal bucket sitting awkwardly in its center. The air felt heavy, unnatural, a sense of dread wrapping around my chest. A dim, flickering lantern hung from the well's side, casting strange shadows that twisted unnaturally in the dark. I set my flashlight on the ground and leaned in close to inspect it. The hole was deep, much deeper than it should have been. The sound of dripping water echoed from the bottom, a slow, monotonous drip that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the well. It came from behind me, from deeper within the woods. It was a woman's voice, soft yet chilling, almost melodic. She was saying something, but the words were indistinct, like they were spoken in a language, lost to time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. I turned back toward the well, gripping my flashlight tightly. The chill deepened and the shadows seemed to shift once again, moving closer, circling the well. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, not driven by wind or natural causes. The lantern flickered harder, its flame sputtering as if something unseen was feeding on it. I reached down to retrieve my flashlight, but as my hand brushed the cold metal, I saw it. Faces, hundreds of them, distorted and gray, pressed against the surface of the water at the bottom of the well. The faces were crying. Silent tears slid down their features, blending into the dark water. Their mouths were twisted in expressions of pain and longing, and their eyes, oh their eyes, hollow, empty, and searching. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping the silence. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me now, voices overlapping and blending into a terrifying symphony of sorrow. I could hear them pleading, crying out, voices from the well, calling for something I couldn't understand. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, though my voice trembled. I didn't realize how far I had retreated until my back hit the rough bark of a tree. The shadows closed in, their form no longer shapes, but human-like figures. Long, gaunt, with hollow faces and lifeless eyes. Their fingers reached out, elongated and grotesque, dragging across the surface of the well, clawing toward me. "Please," I begged, lifting the flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, pushing them back, but they came closer as if drawn to the light. "Leave!" I screamed, feeling my legs give out beneath me. The figures paused at the edge of the light. They stared at me, not with malice, but with despair. Then they began to fade into the shadows once more, their hollow eyes lingering in the darkness. When I looked back at the well, it was still, silent again, save for the slow drip of water. But the faces remained beneath the surface, watching, always watching. I stumbled back through the forest, my legs shaking, my breath uneven. The well was still behind me, a hollow abyss waiting, ready to consume anyone foolish enough to look inside. And I knew, some mysteries should never be uncovered. It had been abandoned for decades, they said. The old carnival on the edge of town was where whispers of disappearances and ghost stories began. My cousin Lily, my brother Matt, and I weren't superstitious, But we were thrill seekers. When we heard about the rumors of the silent Ferris wheel, we knew we had to see it. The carnival grounds were overgrown with weeds, the remnants of rides leaning like skeletons under the pale moonlight. The air smelled of rust and mildew, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the faint creak of old machinery swaying in the wind. "It's just an old theme park," Matt said, kicking a piece of debris. "Nothing scary here," but Lily shushed him. "Do you hear that?" We all stopped. Faint, distant music, circus-like but slow and distorted, drifted through the air. It came from deeper within the grounds where the Ferris wheel loomed like a hulking shadow. "Probably just the wind messing with something," I said, though I didn't believe it. We followed the sound, stepping carefully over fallen beams and debris. The carnival had been frozen in time, like everyone had abandoned it in a rush. Food carts still had faded, rusting signs. A clown cutout with peeling paint grinned at us from a booth, its painted eyes unsettlingly sharp. When we reached the Ferris wheel, it stood tall and ominous, half covered in vines. The metal creaked softly, but there was no wind. And yet one of the cabins swayed gently at the top, as though someone had just climbed aboard. "Look," Lily whispered, pointing to a nearby ticket booth. The window was shattered, and a single ticket sat on the counter, fresh and clean. "Who would leave that here?" Matt asked, his voice low. "It's probably staged. Some prank to scare people," I said, but my voice faltered. Then the music swelled. The Ferris wheel lit up, dim bulbs flickering one by one in unnatural patterns. It began to move slowly, groaning as the rusted gears turned. There was no electricity here, no power source. "We need to leave," Lily said, stepping back, but Matt moved forward, drawn to the glowing ride. "What if someone's controlling it?" "Matt, don't!" I shouted. Before we could stop him, he reached the base of the wheel. He craned his neck to look at the swaying cabin, but his face twisted into horror. "There's someone in there," he said, stumbling back toward us. I grabbed his arm. "What did you see?" "It wasn't human," he whispered. As if in response, the wheel stopped abruptly, the cabin at the top jerking into place. The music cut out, leaving a ringing silence. Then came a voice, distorted and metallic, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. "Your turn," it said. We froze, unsure if we had heard it or imagined it. Then the cabin door at the bottom swung open with a screech, inviting us in. "No way," I said, pulling Matt and Lily away. But the moment we turned to leave, the lights around the carnival blazed to life. Every ride groaned to motion. The carousel spun, its horses moving with unnatural speed. A funhouse door opened with a low moan, shadows flickering inside. The Ferris wheel cabin groaned louder, its open door beckoning us. We tried to run, but the ground shifted under our feet, pulling us closer to the ride. The air grew thick and cold, our breath visible in the moonlight. "What do we do?" Lily screamed. "Don't get on," I shouted, gripping her hand. But then the shadows emerged. Dark figures crawling from the funhouse, the carousel, the food carts. Their movements were jerky, wrong, like puppets held up by invisible strings. They surrounded us, cutting off every escape. The voice returned, louder now. "Your turn." I don't know why I did it, but I stepped forward. "Fine," I said, trembling. "We'll ride. Just let us go afterward." The shadows paused, then melted back into the darkness. The Ferris wheel door swung wider, and the three of us climbed into the cabin, shaking. The ride started, pulling us higher into the air. As we reached the top, the carnival below shifted. The rides disappeared, replaced by black nothingness. The shadowy figures writhed below, their faces melting into screams. The voice returned. "You looked. You stay." But just as I felt the cabin lurch forward, the wheel stopped. The lights blinked out, and the shadows froze. We were sitting in an empty field, the Ferris wheel gone. The carnival was no more, as if it had never been. We ran and never looked back. Weeks later, I developed a rash on my arm. It formed the shape of a Ferris wheel. It had always been a dream of mine to visit the old lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. Lonely and secluded, it stood tall against the crashing waves, weathered by time and the elements. No one had lived there for decades, and the stories surrounding it were enough to keep tourists away. Whispers of strange sounds, shadows moving in the corners of windows, and eerie lights flickering from the tower at night. I had heard those stories, but curiosity won out over fear. With nothing but my camera and a notebook, I set out alone to capture the lighthouse. The journey was long and treacherous, the winding coastal roads cutting through cliffs that seemed to scrape the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sun was sinking below the horizon, leaving the sky in a wash of muted colors. The building loomed over me, massive and imposing. Rusted metal stairs spiraled up the side, disappearing into the top of the tower. I knew there was no electricity, no phone signal, and no one for miles. The isolation was absolute. Still, I was eager to explore. Inside, the air was damp and cool. Old furniture, faded and broken, littered the main room. The walls were lined with photographs and journals, evidence that someone had once called this place home. Dust coated everything, settling like a veil over the long-forgotten memories. Flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I made my way to the staircase. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound echoing down the empty halls. Shadows stretched endlessly in every direction. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, the wind whipping through the open windows. The top of the lighthouse was a narrow room, filled with metal machinery and a glass lens that once guided ships safely through the night. The light had long since died, but the memory of it still hung in the air, a strange, almost tangible presence. I began taking photographs, capturing the decay, the emptiness. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that seems to hum just beyond the ears, a constant, subtle pressure against the senses. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice a whisper in the vast emptiness. There was no response, just the wind outside, battering the lighthouse like a living thing. But the sensation only grew stronger, as though something was watching me, just beyond the edge of sight. I glanced around, camera ready, but there was nothing. Still, I kept snapping photos. The lens flared once, casting an eerie glow in the dark. Looking through the viewfinder, I saw something. A pale face in the corner of the frame. It wasn't there in reality, only in the photograph. A ghastly figure, eyes hollow and mouth slack, peering out from the shadows. I froze, unable to move. Shaking, I snapped another shot, but the face wasn't there anymore. It was gone, as if it had never existed. I checked the photos in disbelief, but each one was empty, just the desolate interior of the lighthouse. My breath quickened. Suddenly, a voice echoed softly in the distance, carried on the wind. "Stay." I spun around. "Who's there?" Silence. But that voice, so close, so clear, lingered in my mind like a haunting melody. I looked out the windows, scanning the coastline. Nothing but waves crashing against the rocks and the infinite horizon. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I felt exposed, trapped by the vast emptiness. My flashlight flickered again, dying for a moment before flickering back to life. It seemed weaker now, the beam wavering as if struggling against something unseen. I stumbled down the stairs, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The lower levels were darker, more enclosed. The wind howled through the windows, but it wasn't enough to drown out the whispers that grew louder with each step. "Leave," the voice whispered again, closer this time, a breath in my ear. I raced toward the door, fumbling with the rusted handle. My flashlight shut off entirely, plunging the lighthouse into complete darkness. Panic surged through me. I heard footsteps, bare, ragged footsteps, on the wooden floor below. They echoed louder and louder, as though whatever was chasing me was right behind me. "Stay with me," the voice said again, this time more insistent, more menacing. With all my strength, I kicked the door open, stumbling into the night. The heaty, sea breeze hit me like a wave, cold and bracing, pushing the whispers away. I ran, toward the car, away from the lighthouse. As I sped down the coast, the images flashed through my mind, the face in the photograph, the voice, the footsteps, and I knew. I knew the lighthouse was alive, a place too long abandoned, too tied to something unnatural, something that had never truly left. To this day, I never returned. The lighthouse still stands there, solitary and quiet. But I can't. Forget the shadows that reside within it. Some places I've learned should never be explored. It was an old house, one that had been abandoned for years. My friends and I had been dared to spend the night, and while I was skeptical, the allure of a night of horror was too much to resist. The house had been sealed shut for decades, with a heavy padlock barring the attic door at the top of the stairs. The main level was covered in dust, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet with every step. Old furniture sat in disrepair, and the air was thick with decay. We laughed at the cliché, at the creaks and whispers that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. But when we reached the top of the stairs, things shifted. The attic door loomed. Before us, solid wood, locked shut with a rusted chain. It looked more like a tomb than a storage space. "We don't have to open it," Sam said, uneasy. "Let's just go home." "Come on," I urged. "There's nothing up there." With a shaky breath, I took hold of the chain. The padlock was rusted, nearly falling apart as I tugged. After a few tense moments, it gave way with a loud snap. The door swung open with a slow creak, revealing darkness beyond. A single flashlight flickered on. We hesitated at the entrance, peering inside. It was a vast, windowless space, filled with cobwebs and stacks of forgotten boxes. The air was colder up here, and something about it felt wrong. "Hello," I called, though my voice barely pierced the silence. No response, just the sound of our breathing and the distant creak of the wooden floor. As we moved deeper into the attic, I snapped photos with my camera. The flash illuminated strange shapes, blurred figures and faces in the corners of the photos that weren't visible to the naked eye. Every image came out distorted, like there were things just beyond our sight, watching. The deeper we ventured, the heavier the atmosphere became. My flashlight flickered again, dying for a moment before reigniting. Sam's camera stopped recording, mid-shot, only to glitch and display corrupted footage, distorted faces, whispering figures, shapes moving just out of reach. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a soft, agonized whisper coming from the shadows. "Leave. Leave," it hissed. A voice so faint it seemed to originate from within my own mind. I spun around, heart racing. "Did you hear that?" "Stop it," Sam hissed, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice a terrified whisper. But just as we began to retreat, the door behind us slammed shut, locked again by unseen hands. The air became frigid, icy cold, creeping into our bones. Shadows crept along the floor, slithering toward us from the corners of the room. The whispers intensified, becoming more distinct, more malevolent. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The walls seemed to close in. My flashlight flickered again, illuminating a figure. Just a glimpse, a fleeting shadow in the corner of the room. It was faceless, but its form was grotesque, hunched and shifting. Its fingers were elongated, reaching toward us like claws. "Get back!" Sam yelled, grabbing Emma's hand. We stumbled toward the entrance, but it was futile. The figure loomed closer, its movements unnatural, its presence oppressive. Through the distorted photos on my camera, I saw it again. Hundreds of figures, hundreds of faces, twisting and writhing beyond comprehension. They weren't human. They never had been. I screamed as the flashlight went out completely. Darkness enveloped us and the whispers turned into deafening screams. The sound of footsteps, not ours, echoed louder and louder with every second. A hand brushed against my shoulder, cold, icy, and real. My breath caught. I couldn't move. In the last moment, I heard the voice again, clearer now. You should have left the attic closed. I've always been afraid of elevators. The idea of being trapped in a small enclosed space with no way out just unnerved me. But when I started my new job, the building had an elevator, and I had no choice but to use it. It wasn't a fancy building, just a nondescript office in the middle of a busy city. The elevator was old, probably as ancient as the building itself. Its brass buttons were worn down and the floor smelled faintly of mildew, but I could never quite put my finger on why. Still, I would get on and press the button to my floor, trying to ignore the sense of dread that would settle in my stomach every time. One Friday evening, after everyone had left for the weekend, I found myself working late. I was tired, eager to get home, and the last thing I wanted was to climb up the stairs to the 8th floor. The elevator was the quickest way out, so I reluctantly stepped in. The moment I pressed the button for the ground floor, something felt wrong. The elevator jolted as if it had been powered off for a split second before starting up again. I brushed it off as a malfunction, nothing to worry about. But then it stopped. It wasn't supposed to stop. The elevator had passed several floors before it abruptly came to a halt between the 3rd and 4th floors. I pressed the emergency button, but the light blinked red and nothing happened. I tried the phone, but the line was dead. I could hear nothing but the faint hum of the elevator's machinery. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself, pushing aside the growing panic. Minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 20. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the faded, chipped doors in front of me. I thought about what to do next, but I was too paralyzed to act. Just as I began to gather the strength to press the emergency button again, the elevator moved. It didn't start from the 3rd floor where it had stopped. It shot straight down, far faster than it should have been able to, shaking violently as it went. I screamed and grabbed the sides of the walls, my heart hammering against my chest. The elevator finally screeched to a halt with such force that it threw me against the back wall. I was dazed but unharmed. But when I opened my eyes, something was different. The lights flickered before settling into a low, sickly yellow glow. The buttons were different now. There were more of them. A whole new row that hadn't been there before. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, but the light didn't turn on. I tried to press a few other buttons, but none lit up. The elevator remained still. The doors suddenly slid open, but what I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It wasn't the building's lobby. It wasn't even the floor I'd last seen before entering the elevator. It was a hallway. A hallway I didn't recognize. The walls were dark, the paint peeling, and there was a low buzzing sound that seemed to come from nowhere. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically. Didn't know where I was. I knew the building, and this wasn't part of it. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively stepped out of the elevator. The second I crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind me, and I heard the unmistakable sound of the elevator descending again. I panicked. I tried the door, but it was locked. I knocked on the walls, yelling for help, but it was useless. There was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the buzzing lights and the oppressive silence. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't my own. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, growing louder with every passing second. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned to run back to the elevator, but before I could reach it, the doors opened again. This time, there was no strange hallway, no unfamiliar setting, just the regular lobby. The normal lobby I knew, the familiar beige carpet, the soft hum of the air conditioning, and the sound of the building's entrance doors opening and closing in the distance. I stepped into the elevator, my legs shaky, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I pushed the button for the ground floor. The elevator moved smoothly this time, as if nothing was wrong. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I was met with a completely normal lobby, bustling with employees and visitors as if the entire evening had been a figment of my imagination. But as I stepped out, I noticed something chilling. There, in the corner of the room, just behind the reception desk, was the same elevator I had just taken. And standing inside it was a figure, staring directly at me with empty eyes. I froze, my heart racing. The figure was me. I work as an audio engineer for a small, independent podcast company. One night, my boss handed me a recording and asked me to clean up the sound for a special episode. Something unusual. It was an old tape, one of those analog cassettes that hadn't been used in years. The label was faded, but it read only 2 words. Listen carefully. Curious, I popped the tape into the machine. The first few seconds were filled with static. Then, a soft voice broke through, barely audible at first. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice, distant, trembling. I turned up the volume to hear better, but as I did, the voice grew clearer. "I need to tell you something. If you hear this, it's too late. It's already too late." I paused the recording, my fingers hovering over the controls. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be listening. But I continued. The voice spoke again. More urgently this time. "Don't trust the man with the glasses. Don't let him in." I couldn't stop listening. The fear in her voice was palpable, and every word sent a chill down my spine. The rest of the recording was a jumble of muffled sounds, breathing, footsteps, and a sharp metallic scraping noise, followed by a loud crash that made me jump. Then came a silence so thick it felt suffocating. "Please," the voice whispered. "They're coming for you. Don't—" The tape cut off abruptly. I rewound the tape and played it again, but this time there was nothing. No voice, no sounds, just dead silence. It didn't make sense. I checked the tape, the machine, everything, but the recording was gone. It was as if it had never been there. I sat in the dark studio, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. Maybe it was a prank, an elaborate hoax. But why would my boss have it? Why ask me to clean it up? Something wasn't right. The next day at work, I didn't say anything. I kept the tape to myself, unsure of how to explain it. When my boss asked about the cleaning, I lied and said there was nothing to fix. He didn't press, but I noticed something odd. His glasses, thick and black, almost like the man from the recording. It was just a coincidence. I convinced myself of that. That night, after leaving work, I decided to head straight home. But as I walked down the street, I saw a man standing across the street staring at me. He was wearing glasses, thick, dark glasses that made his face look oddly distant, obscured. The same glasses as the man from the tape. I froze. My heart raced. Was it him? Had the woman been talking about him? I quickly turned down a side alley, walking faster. The footsteps behind me echoed, growing louder. The man was following me. I broke into a run, my breath coming out in panicked gasps. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, keeping his distance but never breaking pace. Finally, I reached my building. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, gasping for air. But through the window, I could see him still standing across the street. His gaze was locked on me. He didn't move. Hours passed, and I stayed inside, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed something else. There, on my kitchen counter, was the tape. The same faded cassette, the same label. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't brought it home. I stared at It for what felt like an eternity before slowly walking toward it. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. I didn't want to play it. I didn't want to hear that voice again. But I had to know. I put it in the recorder. This time, the voice was clearer than ever, right from the start. You shouldn't have listened. I didn't even need to hear more. I could feel it, the weight of whatever was in the recording pressing in on me. The man with the glasses hadn't left. He was here, in the room with me. I turned around, heart pounding. The room was empty, but the silence felt wrong, too quiet, too suffocating. And then I heard the sound of footsteps. They were coming closer. The museum was old, centuries old, abandoned for years. The city forgot about it, lost beneath modern developments, hidden from view. My friend Jacob and I stumbled upon it by chance. A broken gate, the remains of a crumbling facade. Intrigued, we decided to explore, fueled by the thrill of something forgotten. Inside, the air was thick, stale with the scent of rotten dust. Dim, flickering lights guided our way through the long halls lined with forgotten artifacts. Statues, paintings, and ancient relics were scattered throughout, but something about the place felt off. It wasn't just the dust or the mold, it was the silence, the oppressive stillness. The only sounds were the echoes of our footsteps, amplified by the empty corridors. Jacob whispered, "This feels wrong." I nodded, but my voice caught in my throat. It was more than wrong. It was unnatural. In the farthest hall, we stumbled upon a room, its door ajar. Inside, the walls were lined with mirrors. Not simple mirrors, though. These were cracked, distorted reflections of the museum itself, twisted, warped beyond recognition. Some showed glimpses of other places entirely, places we couldn't comprehend. We moved cautiously, avoiding the mirrors as though they were alive. In the center of the room sat a pedestal, empty save for a single object, a black, weathered book. It was ancient, covered in symbols we couldn't read. Every time we moved closer, an eerie chill seemed to settle over us, sapping the warmth from the air. Jacob ran his fingers over the symbols. This isn't normal." "No," I whispered. "We should leave." But something kept us, rooted in place. I felt the weight of the room pressing down on me, the oppressive silence turning into something almost alive. The mirrors flickered, and for a moment, I saw something in the reflection, a figure standing behind us. The room itself seemed to pulse with energy, as though it was feeding on our presence. "Run," I managed to say, but my voice was hoarse. Jacob tried to pull me away, but the book trembled on its pedestal, and suddenly, the mirrors shattered, in unison, sharp, piercing cracks that echoed through the room. I stumbled back, covering my ears, but it was as though the sound went straight through me. In the fragments of the mirrors, I saw them. Faces, dozens of them. Distorted, screaming faces that didn't belong to the past or the present. They filled the glass, mouths open in silent torment, their eyes hollow and empty. Jacob fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the sheer terror. "They're here," he gasped. "They're watching." Suddenly, the mirrors moved. Not physically, but they seemed alive, shifting slowly, always reflecting something new. Faces began to press through the glass, hands reaching out, clawing. For us. The air grew colder. I could feel the icy touch of fingers brushing against my skin. The book began to chant. Low, guttural whispers in an ancient language. The words twisted in the air, wrapping around us like a noose. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The mirrors, the book, or something unseen. But the effect was immediate. My vision blurred, and I felt as if the world itself was folding inward. "Leave," I cried, but my voice was drowned by the chanting, and then there was nothing but darkness. We had just moved into the old apartment building downtown. The place was cheap, secluded, and isolated from the rest of the city. The building itself looked like it hadn't seen anyone go in or out for years. Dust-covered windows, peeling paint, and the smell of mildew filled the air as we stepped through the front door. The landlord had warned us about some quirks, but we didn't think much of it. Our first night in the apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel exposed. We didn't think much of the creaking sounds coming from the floors, or the occasional draft whispering through the cracks. The next night, though, something changed. It started with a knock. One soft, hollow knock at the front door. We froze. There were no visitors. Nobody had been inside the building for as long as we knew. Ryan, always the brave one, made his way to the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing, just the empty hallway. "Maybe the wind," he muttered, half joking. We exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off. That was until the knocking came again, this time louder. A relentless, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the old building. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. None of us wanted to move. We were rooted in place, our hearts racing. Every knock seemed to come from a different part of the apartment. Sometimes from the door, sometimes from the walls, and other times from above us. The sounds grew closer, surrounding us, closing in as if whatever was making them was right, there in the room with us. That's when the whispering started. It was soft at first, barely audible. Then it grew louder, more distinct. "Let us in." The voice wasn't human, though it sounded like it had once been. The words were muffled, distorted, as if the speaker was trying to force them through, some otherworldly filter. We couldn't understand what was happening, but the fear was overwhelming. Emma tried to move toward the window, hoping maybe there was someone outside, but as soon as she got close, the knocking intensified, the whispers growing louder. We could feel them inside our heads now. We locked ourselves in the bedroom, doors barricaded, hearts pounding. The knocking continued throughout the night, never ceasing, never fading. The whispers turned to screams, shrill and hollow, reverberating off the walls of the old building. It was as if the entire apartment had come alive, its very structure trying to consume us. Morning didn't bring relief. We opened the door to silence, the apartment exactly as we left it. No signs of intrusion, no footsteps, no broken locks. But the whispers, those echoes, never left us. They haunt us now, in every quiet moment. Whatever was with us that night didn't come from outside. It had been there all along, waiting, and it never truly left. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. I was house-sitting for an old friend, just a routine task. The house was in a quiet suburb, nothing unusual about it. My friend had asked me to stay for a few days while they were out of town, and the idea of having a large, empty house all to myself seemed like a peaceful escape from the usual noise of the city. The house wasn't particularly old, but it had a strange, faded charm. The walls were lined with family photos that had begun to yellow with age, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. It was well kept, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The silence was too heavy, too deliberate, as if the house was holding its breath. On the first night, I kept the lights on. The silence felt oppressive, and I couldn't bring myself to wander through the darkened hallways. But by the second night, curiosity got the better of me. The house felt strangely familiar, like I had been there before, though I knew I hadn't. As I roamed through the dimly lit rooms, I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. Every corner I turned seemed just a little too shadowy. That's when I noticed the whispers. They started faint, barely audible, like they were carried on the wind. I figured it was just the house settling, but as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls, but whenever I pressed my ear to them, they stopped. It was as if the house itself was trying to speak, only to fall silent when I paid attention. By the third night, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. They echoed through the house, now distinct words, soft, chilling, and indecipherable. I kept moving from room to room, but no matter how far I walked, they followed. It felt as though the house had come alive, consumed by some unseen force. Then, around midnight, the lights flickered and died. Panic shot through me as I realized the house was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but my signal was gone. I was cut off from the world. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like any I'd ever heard. No one walks like that. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was making those sounds didn't have legs. The pacing grew louder, closer. Then a knock. Just one, but it wasn't at the door. Came from inside the walls. A hollow knock, repeated over and over as though someone was trapped behind them, trying to escape. My blood ran cold as I backed away, feeling trapped and surrounded by darkness. I didn't know how long I stood there, but soon the whispers became more than just disembodied sounds. They were calling to me. They seemed to come from all around, each word spoken clearer than before. "Let us out," they pleaded. "Please, help us." In a moment of sheer terror, I bolted for the front door. I didn't care about the force keeping me there. I had to escape. But as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, I realized it wasn't my front door. The house I was standing in wasn't the one I had entered. I had stepped into a house identical to the one I had come from. Same layout, same old photos on the walls. But something was different. The air was colder, the silence deeper, and the whispers had followed me, now louder and more desperate. I didn't dare go back inside. Instead, I ran into the night, my breath clouding in the freezing air. The whispers still echo in my mind. Each word burned into my memory. And even though I made it out, I know the house isn't done with me. Sometimes I hear those whispers in my sleep. They're never far. They're still calling. I always believed there was no place more haunted than an old house until it happened to me. It wasn't a cabin or a secluded forest retreat. No, it was a city apartment complex. New, modern, and seemingly ordinary. But something about my new place felt off. I moved into the city apartment 2 months ago, right after finishing college. It was supposed to be a fresh start. A quiet, comfortable place where I could focus on my new job and independence. The building itself wasn't old, but it wasn't new either. A mid-century design, with a sterile beige exterior and faded brick, surrounded by other buildings that looked just as unremarkable. On the first night, everything was normal. The apartment was small but cozy. I unpacked, set up my desk, and settled into my bed. But that night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing faint sounds from beyond the walls. A faint creaking, almost like footsteps, but not quite. I dismissed it as the usual creaks of an old building settling. The next night, the sounds became more distinct. This time, it wasn't just creaking. It was whispering, soft, low murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I tried to convince myself it was just the building's old pipes settling, but the whispers didn't stop. They were insistent, as if someone was trying to speak directly to me. I couldn't make out what they were saying, though. It wasn't clear words, just distorted, slurred sounds. I tried to ignore it, but as the days passed, the whispers became louder and more persistent. They seemed to follow me, echoing in different parts of the apartment, always when I was alone. The real terror began a week into my stay. One night, after hearing the whispers growing louder again, I finally decided to confront whatever it was. I stood in the hallway, breathless, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. My hands shook as I strained to hear anything beyond the walls, but there was nothing. For a moment, I thought the apartment had returned to normal. Then I felt it. Breath on the back of my neck. Cold, invisible, and unmistakable. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispering began again, this time louder, closer. It wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my head. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. Sleep was impossible that night. The whispers continued, now a cacophony of distorted voices, some high-pitched, others guttural and low. It felt as though they were inside my skull, each one screaming silently, their distorted words echoing endlessly. Desperation set in. The next day, I tried to reach out to anyone, friends, neighbors, but they all dismissed my concerns. They couldn't hear the whispers. They couldn't see the shadows I swore were lurking at the edges of my vision. Weeks passed in this torment. Every night the whispers grew louder, and each day my paranoia deepened. I started noticing strange things. Faint silhouettes in the corners of my apartment. Dark shapes that would flicker when I turned to look. But they weren't solid. They were hollow, void-like, always lurking just beyond my sight. Then came the night when everything changed. I awoke suddenly, gasping for breath. The apartment was pitch black, the only light from the street lamp outside. I tried to move, but my limbs wouldn't respond. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. In the dark, I heard them again. Closer now. The whispers had turned into screams, a chorus of distorted voices screaming my name. It felt as though they were inside my mind, tearing at my thoughts. I could feel their presence surrounding me, as if they were pressing against my skin. Suddenly, the air shifted, and the temperature dropped drastically. I could feel the breath again, cold, heavy, on my neck. A whisper came so close it felt as though it was inside my very skull. "Get out." I didn't wait. Somehow, I managed to force my body to move. I ran, stumbling into the hallway, tears streaming down my face. The front door slammed open, and I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was out of the building, gasping for air, the sounds still reverberating in my head. The apartment remains empty now. I can't bring myself to return, and I doubt I ever will. Whatever was there, the whispers, the shadows, the presence, I can't explain it. But I know one thing for certain. Some places leave a mark, and that apartment was one of them. I survived, but the echoes of that night haunt me. I hear the whispers in my dreams, sometimes in waking moments, as if they're still searching, still waiting. Whatever they were, they're not gone, and neither am I. When I was a kid, my family lived on a small farm at the edge of a sprawling cornfield. It wasn't the idyllic countryside you'd see in paintings. Our house was old and creaky, and the cornfield seemed endless, especially at night. It was the kind of place where silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on you when the wind wasn't blowing. One summer evening, my parents went into town for supplies, leaving me and my older brother in charge of the place. The sun had just set, leaving streaks of orange and purple on the horizon. We were supposed to feed the animals and lock up the barn, but instead, we decided to play hide-and-seek in the cornfield. The rules were simple. Stay within the first 10 rows and don't go too far from the house. My brother, always the braver one, volunteered to hide first. He darted into the tall stalks of corn while I counted to 50. The corn rustled as he moved, the sound growing fainter as he pushed deeper into the field. When I finished counting, I called out for him, stepping into the rows with a mix of excitement and unease. The corn loomed high above me, blocking out the moonlight. Every step felt louder than it should have, the dry leaves brushing against my arms and legs. "Come out," I called, trying to sound confident. No answer, just the soft whisper of the wind moving through the corn. I laughed nervously, convinced he was trying to scare me. I pushed forward, parting the stalks, my heart thumping a little harder with every step. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound ahead of me, like footsteps. dragging through the dirt. I froze, listening. "Gotcha!" I yelled, sprinting toward the noise. But when I burst through the stalks, I stopped cold. It wasn't my brother. There was someone standing there, just a few rows ahead of me, their back turned. They were tall and unnaturally thin, with arms hanging too long by their sides. "Jason," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to retrace my steps. But as I turned, I realized I was lost. The rows of corn looked the same in every direction, and the farmhouse was nowhere in sight. I called out for my brother again, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard the laughter. It wasn't loud, it was faint and distant, like it was being carried on the wind. But it wasn't Jason's laugh. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from a throat that didn't quite know how to laugh. The rustling started again, this time from all around me. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere. My breathing grew shallow as I stumbled through the rows, the stalks closing in tighter. Then I saw it again, the figure. But this time, it was closer. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if it was trying to see me without turning all the way around. The laughter came again, louder now, and I bolted, pushing through the corn as fast as I could. The stalks scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I burst into the clearing near the house, panting and covered in dirt. Jason was standing by the barn, holding a flashlight, his face pale. "Where were you?" he yelled, his voice trembling. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he cut me off. "We need to go inside. Now." That's when I noticed it. His hands were shaking, and his flashlight beam kept darting to the edge of the cornfield. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. The figure was standing at the edge of the field, half hidden in the shadows. Its face was still obscured, but I could see its arms, long, spindly things that hung down past its knees. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, almost insect-like. We ran inside, slamming the door and locking it. Jason pulled the curtains shut, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out. The figure was gone, but the cornfield seemed alive, swaying as if something was moving through it. We didn't sleep that night. When my parents came home the next morning, we told them what had happened. They didn't believe us, of course, but they didn't have to. That afternoon, we found footprints in the dirt outside the barn. They were huge, far too big to belong to any human, and leading from the footprints were drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled back into the cornfield. We never played hide-and-seek again. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. "Just the house settling," Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. Could be an animal, Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. Go away. I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. It's nothing, Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. Just the ocean. But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. Leave. I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist and the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. It's here, I gasped. It's still here. Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. Leave now. Panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. We didn't know what we were walking into. The old apartment building stood in the heart of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The landlord had been eager to rent it out despite the whispers of its dark history. After months of searching for a place, we were desperate. It seemed like the perfect fit. The apartment itself was cramped, walls cracked with age, and a lingering musty smell that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. We didn't mind at first. Desperation had a way of dulling the senses. But as we settled in, things began to feel off. It started small. The lights flickered late at night, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, even though we knew no one else lived in the building. There were no neighbors to hear or investigate. Still, we chalked it up to old wiring or perhaps creaky floors settling over time. That's what we told ourselves. Then, the dreams began. Every night, the same dream. A dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, watching silently. Its presence filled the room, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. Every night, I woke up gasping, only to find the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation lingered. One evening, Emma said something that froze me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We were sitting in the living room, the window partially open to let in the cool breeze. But beyond the glass there was a faint hum. Low, distorted, almost mechanical. It grew louder, closer, until the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't coming from outside, it seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." Emma's eyes widened as she stared. at me, her voice trembling. "It's getting louder. Listen." The hum became unbearable, like a malfunctioning machine deep within the building, something dark and twisted that shouldn't exist. We covered our ears, trying to block it out, but it felt like the sound was inside our very skulls, vibrating through our bones. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, so soft that they seemed to drift in the corners of our minds. But soon, they morphed into full sentences, and they were speaking directly to us. "Get out." The voice wasn't just in our heads, it was in the room. I felt its breath on my neck, cold and sharp. It was close, too close. "Run," the voice said again, deeper this time, colder, more commanding. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The locks jammed, as if something unseen had seized control. The windows, once our only escape route, were shattered, fragments of glass scattered across the floor. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling the space until we couldn't think straight. They whispered of forgotten deeds, of souls trapped, unable to rest. The dark figure from my dreams materialized in the room, standing in front of us, its eyes empty, voids of darkness that devoured all light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, her voice quivering. The figure stepped closer, and we could feel its chilling presence. The air grew colder, too cold. Every breath we took was like inhaling ice. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared into its lifeless eyes. "We don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice strained. The entity tilted its head, an unnatural movement before it spoke again, its voice weaving between us like a dark web. Escape is futile. Desperation surged through us. I shouted, screaming into the void, but the whispers swallowed my voice. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate to tear through them, while Ryan pounded on the windows, even as shards cut into his hands. But nothing worked. The presence only grew stronger. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, the hum stopped. The whispers ceased. The dark figure blinked once, its eyes flickering as if coming to consciousness. The entire apartment fell silent. We didn't waste a second. Without speaking, we bolted through the hallway, shoving open doors, desperate for any exit. And there it was, a small back staircase hidden in the shadows. We fled down it, falling over each other in our haste, ignoring the burning in our legs. At the bottom, we burst into the alley, breathless and alive. The city seemed normal again. Noise, light, movement. But we didn't stop. We kept running, heart pounding in sync with the chaos that had just unfolded. When we dared to look back, the building was empty, still and undisturbed, like it had never happened. No signs of life, no trace of the horrors we experienced. We never spoke of what had transpired that night again. The apartment had become our shared nightmare, something too impossible to comprehend, let alone explain. To this day, we avoid that part of the city. We don't know what still lingers there, and honestly, we don't want to find out. It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening at home, the kind of evening where you sit on the couch zoning out in front of the flickering TV while the world outside hums along like always. But that night was anything but ordinary. I had just finished a long day, feeling exhausted and ready to relax. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint sound of the wind outside rattling the window. The neighbors' usual sounds, the creak of floorboards above me, the muffled conversations. Through the thin walls were all as familiar as ever. I didn't think twice about it, too tired to care. At some point, though, I started to notice something strange. A subtle shift in the usual background noise, a faint, uneven breathing that didn't belong to me. I froze, sitting up straighter, listening harder. It wasn't coming from the TV or any of my usual appliances. It wasn't static. It was close, too close. I turned off the TV, the silence growing deafening. The only sound now was that breathing. Slow, steady, as if someone were right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the dim light from the hallway. My pulse quickened, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The apartment felt empty, the familiar creak of floorboards upstairs seeming just a little louder now. I told myself it was the wind, the old building settling. Still, the breathing didn't stop. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator answered, asking if I was safe. I wanted to tell her I was, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. Then, a soft knock echoed from the front door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I listened as the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I considered what to do. There was no way I could ignore it. Slowly, I stood and approached the door, my hand hovering over the lock. I peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway. I pulled back, the sound of breathing still echoing softly behind me. It felt like someone was right there, just inches away. That's when I heard the knocking again, this time closer. It wasn't at the door anymore. It was coming from inside the apartment, from inside my walls. I ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My phone was still on, the 911 operator still asking questions, but I couldn't answer. I could hear the breathing now, muffled but unmistakable, coming from behind the walls. It was as if someone had somehow found a way inside, but I couldn't see them. The knocking continued, growing louder, more frantic. My walls trembled with each thud. I could feel the vibrations under my feet. My mind raced, every rational thought abandoning me. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear held me still. Then, silence. The operator was still on the line, whispering, "Are you still there?" But there was nothing I could say. The only sound was my shallow breaths. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard it, the faintest creak, just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, heart thudding against my ribs. The door handle twisted, slowly turning. I backed away from the door, phone still in hand. My fingers trembled as I prayed that whoever, or whatever, was out there would leave. But then, a voice. Soft, distant, almost like a whisper, but clear enough to make me shiver. "I can hear you." I didn't move. I didn't answer. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body couldn't respond. The door creaked open, and for a moment, everything was still. Then a figure appeared, just a shadow in the dim light. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its face was indistinct, but I could see hollow, empty eyes, void of any life. It took a step closer, and I realized, in that frozen instant, that it wasn't something from this world. And then, it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I don't know if I'll ever forget what I saw. But what haunts me more than anything is knowing that whatever was there, whatever it was never really gone. It was a late autumn evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to an old, abandoned lighthouse on the edge of the coast. None of us had ever been there, and the place had always been rumored to be haunted. Skeptical, as we all were, we figured it would make for an eerie, atmospheric adventure. The lighthouse stood tall against the backdrop of a dark, churning sea. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of an old wooden pier as we parked the car a few miles down the narrow, winding road. The air was heavy with mist and the salty tang of the ocean. We all felt the shift in the atmosphere as we stepped out of the car, the warmth of the day fading fast. As we approached the base of the lighthouse, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if the darkness itself was watching us. The structure loomed in front of us, its once pristine white paint now weathered and peeling. The steps spiraled upwards into the sky, vanishing into the dense fog that had rolled in. "We'll split up," Matt said, his voice breaking the silence. That way, we cover more ground. One of us can check out the bottom while the rest go up. Against my better judgment, we agreed. I could feel the weight of the ancient stone beneath my feet as I started climbing, the sounds of my friend's footsteps fading below. Each creaking step seemed louder than the last, the wind growing stronger as I ascended. The higher I climbed, the colder the air became. I paused, turning back to glance at the fog that now swallowed the ground below. My heart pounded in my chest. It was so quiet, except for the sound of my own breath and the faint echo of the wind. When I finally reached the top, I pushed open the rusted door, stepping into the narrow space of the lighthouse. The view from the top was breathtaking. Mist rolling in every direction, the sea stretching out beyond the horizon, waves crashing against the rocks below. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick, as if it had a weight of its own. The sound of the wind was different now, more oppressive, as if it carried something more than just the chill of the ocean. I turned to scan the interior of the lighthouse, its walls lined with faded photographs of sailors and their families, some so old they were barely recognizable. That's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing by the window, its shape barely distinguishable from the fog. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw its outline, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared right through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body felt frozen as the figure turned, slightly, facing me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, like a ghostly silhouette against the window. The wind howled louder, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket. My legs trembled as I slowly backed away, my hand gripping the cold metal railing. Suddenly, I heard voices below. "Guys, where are you?" It was Matt, his voice frantic. "Come on, we need to get out of here." "Matt," I yelled, panic rising in my throat. "There's something up here." Before I could react, the figure began to move, floating towards me with unnatural grace. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the narrow stairs. I could feel the presence closing in, the figure growing larger with every step I took down. When I finally reached the bottom, my friends were waiting, eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I saw it," I managed to say, breathless. "It was up there, watching me." The rest of the night passed in silence. We didn't speak much as we packed up and left the lighthouse behind. The figure, whatever it was, haunted my thoughts, its hollow gaze etched in my mind. I still don't know what I saw that night, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, I find myself staring out into the fog, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching from the distance.